Okay, we're officially live. Sorry to our online audience for being a few minutes late. It's because we were so happy to be reunited, or at least I was. I just got back from Beijing where I visited my grandpa, and so I was really happy to see everyone. So we were chit-chatting for a long time. But it's October 14th, 2023, with another edition of the Society of Free School for Philosophy and Black Liberation. And I think today we're gonna first talk about Israel's war on Gaza and the Palestinians. And then after that, I think we'll go into a topic that we didn't get to last week, which was on the civilization state, especially around Putin's recent speech at Valdai. So I'm gonna hand it off to Doc to start us off on Israel and Palestine.
Thank you. I'm not going to go into a lot of background. I think we all know what the background is. We all know what the current situation is in a certain sense, but I'll talk a little bit about that. But I want to start with what happened last Saturday. In fact, while we were in free school, there was this breach of the fence and the wall, which is electrified, that surrounds Gaza and separates it from Israel. And so you have two worlds side by side. In Gaza, 80% of the people live in poverty, 50% are unemployed, and I'm certain that if you get to young men, it's even higher, because that's the way the oppressor operates. Humiliate the men and leave the women and children to themselves. And on the other side, you have these kibbutzes, you have these well-fed, more or less rich or well-to-do Jews who are also identified as white. Palestinians are not and do not identify as white. So it is a color line. However, last week the wall was breached. The Hamas fighters took over at least 8 Israeli military bases and outposts. And all of this was done while at the same time shutting down the whole network of electronic surveillance of almost every Palestinian in Gaza. Wow. How was it done? Now, there's an article on the front page of the New York Times this morning, which I highly recommend, because it does, in fact, begin to show how important and strategic this event was. The Israelis and the West are trying to say this is an attack upon civilization, which is really them saying this was an attack upon white people and whiteness, and it must be punished. And this is what we see going on. And I'll come back to this, but it has not fooled the majority of people in the world. And, you know, the Zionists are always, you know, trying to control the narrative space, and this claim that, quote unquote, they hate us because we're Jews, hence it's anti-Semitic. The fact of the matter is they hate you because you're the oppressor. Right. No matter what your religion or ethnicity is, any oppressor is hated by the oppressed. Right. But this event of last Saturday, carried out by approximately 2,000 Hamas fighters, which according to all accounts, they're highly trained, highly organized, and had some capabilities militarily that no one thought they had. And that meant the pre-planning for the event itself, where they had more knowledge and information about the intelligence, both electronic and human intelligence, of the Israelis than the Israelis thought they had. And according to this New York Times article, the first targets of the assault were the intelligence command centers. Once they had taken them over, the Israelis were blinded. They could not see what was going on. Now, Scott Ritter says that all of this was possible because the Israelis had become reliant upon artificial intelligence. I think that's only a part of it. But what happened once they had seized the command centers and the intelligence centers, the Hamas fighters then went about attacking the military bases. And according to the New York Times article today, they say at least 8 were overrun, which meant more intelligence fell into their hands, as well as weapons and other things. It was an example of what is called asymmetric warfare, where the weaker plays upon and takes advantage of the, quote, strengths which can be flipped into weaknesses of their opponents. Asymmetric warfare is what we have seen in so many national liberation struggles, including the Chinese struggle, Mao's concept of People's War, of course in Vietnam, and in Korea, the Korean War. In the face of having flipped the relationship of power and strategic strengths from the stronger now to the weaker, and it happens every time practically, the oppressor, which has now been shown to be not so powerful, then resorts to bombing. Korea, Vietnam, and now with Israel and Gaza. And what they tried to do is not, because they now know, I mean, after 70 years or more of experience with asymmetric warfare, the oppressing and colonizing forces now know that these bombings only drive the masses closer to the revolutionaries. You know, after the shock and trauma, and it is, I mean, the Gazan people are going through tremendous shock and trauma. This is a war against ordinary people. It is genocidal, it is a war crime, and it is racist.
Very.
But after that initial shock, the people then find their way to the revolutionaries. I want to talk about Frantz Fanon, and his concept of the psychology of the oppressor and the psychology of the oppressed. These events have fundamentally changed the political and military equation between Israel and the Palestinians. Not that the Palestinians have won, but the Israelis, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, suffered what I would call a strategic defeat. The relationship between the Palestinians and the Israelis, including the Israeli population will never be the same. I analogize it to the Tet Offensive of 1968 in Vietnam. You know, for the most part, between around 1965, 64, and 1968, the National Liberation Forces, which had been called by the West the Viet Cong, meaning the Vietnam Communists, they were not all communists, it's a united front, you know, were waging hit and run, late night attacks upon the Army of the United States. At that point, Ho Chi Minh and the Army of North Vietnam did not engage because they were not convinced or certain about the political military character of the Viet Cong or the National Liberation Front. However, with the Tet Offensive, just like the situation with Hamas in Israel, the U.S. Army did not see it coming. They couldn't figure out where it came from. And very similarly, suddenly, sporadic hit and run activities, mainly at night, because most of the fighters, you know, worked in their fields by day or worked for the U.S. military or other jobs, but by night they would be guerrillas. In this instance, we saw a unified political and military uprising. The Tet Offensive, while the United States military took back important gains, physical gains, they never reversed the politics of the war in Vietnam. After the Tet Offensive, the North Vietnamese government committed themselves to the fight in the South. And that opened up a very interesting thing called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which then brought Cambodia into the war, and the great Prince Norodom Sihanouk, you know, who allowed the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese, to use pathways in Cambodia and then coming in to Vietnam, the famous Ho Chi Minh Trail. But in this and it changed the geography of the war in Vietnam, and 6 years later, it's over. But the United States had been losing and had gone to a situation of Vietnamization of the struggle, and once they went there, it was over because the South Vietnamese army was not an army that wanted to fight. And the United States was in this gradual removing of its troops and so on. So the Tet Offensive changed the politics and the military geography of the war in Vietnam. I think this did the same. Just, you know, and this is not yet proven because the Israelis and Western governments, well, first of all, they have realized how vulnerable the Israeli military is to Hamas. That's a bad feeling when you always assume that you were the strongest military in the Middle East, that you were invulnerable. And of course, they're promised to be able to protect the Israeli people. So arrogantly, they would move kibbutzes, these communities, right up next to Gaza. You know, and you know, while you got swimming pools and having, you know, big Woodstock type concerts and stuff, these people are on lockdown 24/7. You know, and of course we'll get to it later. The souls of young men. This is very, well, I'll come to that in a minute. So arrogant, because they thought the IDF could protect them. And they had all of these military outposts, heavily armed, and every Israeli is armed. The kibbutzes are armed to the teeth. And so, but see, the thing is, how did they break out of that fence? You know, which is electrified. I mean, there was so many tactical obstacles that they had to surmount. It was masterful. And the Israelis now, the Israeli population feels vulnerable and frightened, you know?
Good.
As they should be.
Yes.
But the point I wanted to make again is that now the West, because the Israelis, who I have to say, you know, at some point the oppressor is driven mad. You know, the arrogance to think that you can forever oppress a group of people. Suddenly, you can't. There's something I'm trying to say too much at the same time. So this was a strategic victory. Nothing close to this has happened in that part of the world since 2006. The war between Hezbollah and Israel, where Hezbollah, and you'll hear in the news, well, they're Shiite and the Hamas is Sunni, and you know, and they don't get along. Well, that's what you say. They might differ religiously, but they might not differ in terms of military strategy. What might occur if the Israelis go into Gaza? I'm going to talk about that. With all of these tanks, all of these soldiers, most of whom don't want to fight. But they've been sitting outside of Gaza for, I think now, 4 days. All these tanks, we're going to go in, we're going to go. So Blinken goes in and says, you know, chill, don't go, you know, because this you might make a bad situation even worse, which is true. If the Israeli army goes into Gaza, which has its own difficulties for them, you know, urban guerrilla warfare is not set up for tanks and that type of thing, and the type of training the Israeli army has. They don't know the traps that'll be set for them. They don't know anything that will happen. And given what Hamas just showed, the Israelis are being very cautious. But more than the military situation is the world, which we said is transforming from a unipolar to a multipolar, what we call a Afro-Asiatic reconfiguration of the world. The BRICS, which now includes Saudi Arabia and the Arab Emirates, as well as South Africa, and you know what I'm saying, BRICS plus 6, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the various alliances between Asian countries, but also between Asian and African countries, the crisis of neocolonialism, and we'll get to the United States in a minute. We're in a new and more positive situation. I can't say, the Israelis are going to go in to Gaza, but they're not going to go in like they want to go in, and they're going to find a way to come out. And they might not go in. I still think it's 50-50. that they will go in there. Because the United States and the West are saying, hey man, don't do anything stupid because it's going to be on us. Because we have armed y'all, you know. And don't do anything to set off a wider regional war that would bring Hezbollah and maybe Iran into it. And don't do anything so stupid that it will affect the global economy by affecting the price of oil. I mean, you know, once you get beyond all of the hoopla on CNN and MSNBC and in the, you know, after you peel the onion back and you see how rotten to the core Israeli society is and how it was broken. Now, just a couple of other quick things. You know, according to the New York Times article, they have documents captured from certain of the Hamas fighters which show they had been planning this for about a year. But here is the issue. How did they penetrate Israeli intelligence? Nobody has written this, I'm just speculating. Whenever usually I would say, when something like this happens, people inside are cooperating with Hamas and the Palestinians. In other words, there are Israelis who were cooperating with Hamas. This makes Israelis feel even more vulnerable. And also, over the spring and summer of this year, there were these huge demonstrations of hundreds of thousands of Israelis protesting the Netanyahu government and its proposal to change, you know, the Supreme Court and Constitution. Never has Israeli society been divided like this. Never. So it's already brittle. Netanyahu is a very unpopular president or prime minister. He is also, if he is defeated in the next election, he could go to jail. And all of this is affecting the psychology of the Israeli people. So who is the person inside of the persons inside the Israeli intelligence and military that may have given information to Hamas? I just say all of this again to say, without having all the details, that the political and military battlefield has changed qualitatively. Now, the Israeli government is in shambles. In fact, I think the political crisis in Israel is deeper than the one in this country. And we know how deep this is. Netanyahu is less popular than Biden is. He threw together a government of the most extreme Zionist and really crazy people who, and then, by the way, carried out a provocation which was the trigger to what happened last Saturday. And that was, and these settlers keep doing this, going up and violating Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third most holy site in world Islam. They continue to do it, and then went so far as to say, we want to destroy Al-Aqsa and build the temple. I forget what, they're supposedly an ancient Hebrew temple that was on this mount. It's called the Mount of, I forget now. And they want to go and tear down Al-Aqsa Mosque, which has been there for well over 1,000 years, and rebuild this synagogue.
Wow.
That is a blow to Muslims all over the world, but it seems was the trigger. And these people in the Netanyahu cabinet, by the way, you know, Netanyahu's from Philadelphia.
What? How did he get to Philadelphia?
Neighborhood kid.
Yeah. No, he's a
Neighborhood kid.
from Cheltenham.
Yeah.
Went to high school, all of that. Yeah, so
A neighborhood kid.
Oh, really?
but hold on, let me just continue. That's just
Al-Aqsa Mosque.
That's so.
Netanyahu. Oh, wow.
Al-Aqsa.
yeah, the mosque. So that was kind of a trigger. And so when Hamas carries out this, I think they call it Al-Aqsa storm,
Flood.
Yeah, it's down
Flood.
Flood.
The flood.
Al-Aqsa flood, which is, you know, the mosque. So that resonates with Muslims all over the world.
Yeah.
Because then they're saying we are standing up to protect
Yeah.
the third holiest site in Islam, which cannot be ruled out as an important thing in the psychology of warfare and resistance.
Yes.
Right.
Which means that now you got 1.5 billion people who have utter contempt for the Israeli regime.
Wow.
And they don't hate you because you're Jews.
Right.
They hate you because you are oppressors and your disrespect of Islam. Okay. The world has changed. The nations of the Middle East, who suffered one of the most humiliating defeats in the history of any group of people in 1967, when the Israelis launched a war against Egypt and Syria, the two most powerful Arab nations at that time, and have occupied lands of Egypt, of Syria, of Lebanon, of Jordan since that time, over 50 years, and have been intransigent and have become increasingly intransigent about the Palestinian question, where from time to time, in the most arrogant way, they'll say, well, the Palestinian homeland is in Jordan, not the land that you all have taken and continue to expand on. But the world has changed. The people of the world have changed. Yesterday, throughout the world, especially in the Muslim world and the Arab world, there were huge demonstrations of millions of people marching in solidarity with the Palestinian people. Huge demonstrations. But then there were demonstrations in the United States and throughout the West. In New York, there was a demonstration of several thousand people. I don't know, it's hard to find out, but at least several thousand people in Manhattan and Brooklyn, led by, and this is very significant, Jewish Voices for Peace. And now, the fragmenting or the separation of those Jews who are literally saying, and I'm going to put this in Baldwinian terms, we have to save our soul. Why should we carry the blood of the Palestinian people on our hands when these are the actions produced by a racist regime? Now, a lot of these young Jewish students have been involved in anti-racist marches, anti-racist conferences, and so on. to the extent that they understand the anti-racist struggle. But anyway, how can you say, well, I'm against racism in Minneapolis when it comes to George Floyd, but I don't see the same thing, even worse, happening to Palestinians?
Right.
You know, that kind of inconsistency, moral inconsistency. So at Harvard University, and this is highly significant, 30 student organizations came together behind a statement saying that that Israel was responsible for what took place. They did not compromise, and we'll come back to this thing. Did Hamas carry out crimes against humanity? I want to come back to that. Even if there were excesses, and I'm not going to concede that, but I'm saying even if there were, these students, 30 student organizations, said Israel is responsible.
Wow.
This has never happened.
That's amazing.
At the University of Pennsylvania, there was a Palestinian Writers' Conference a couple weeks ago. And in the wake of what happened last Saturday and going forward, a big donor to Wharton School of Business, he and his wife have given $50 million, said that he wants the president of the University of Pennsylvania and the board, the president, chairman of the board of trustees, to step down. Because they allowed this conference that had in it, and this is now the Zionist narrative, anti-Semites, and people who had made statements against the state of Israel. Like that makes you an anti-Semite. But anyway, the conflation of things, you know. And the fact that the president of the University of Pennsylvania last Monday issued a statement celebrating last Monday, which in some quarters is known as Columbus Day. She wrote a message to the university celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day, and did not include a statement condemning Hamas. So this rich philanthropist, hedge fund, casino capitalist operator called for her to be fired and for the head of the board of trustees, which set off a battle within the board of trustees. But nonetheless, the president has not apologized, nor has the head of the board of trustees. But then a big donor to Harvard, Jewish, said that he wanted the president and the administration at Harvard to reveal all of the names of the students that signed on to this statement.
Wow.
Because he wanted to know who they were, so he would never hire them.
Right.
The president of Harvard, who now is a black woman, but it's not because she's a black woman, said, well, we're not going to do that. At least at Harvard, we have to uphold the right of freedom of speech. This is very significant politically, because it looks a lot like early student protests at places like Harvard and Columbia in the early days of the student movement against the war in Vietnam. Now, you know, Antony Blinken and Austin, the Secretary of Defense, they ran over to Israel. The United States has sent into the Eastern Mediterranean the largest aircraft carrier in the world, the Gerald R. Ford. Now, it just isn't like an aircraft carrier, it's an aircraft carrier battle group, including cruisers, battleships, and submarines to the Eastern Mediterranean. Well, obviously, this has nothing to do with Gaza, but everything to do with Iran. Again, the Biden administration pushing the envelope, entering into brinksmanship. Because if they want a wider war, it could happen, but it would affect the whole world economy, including the United States, driving inflation up, which by the way went up last month, 3.7%, and crashing the US economy at a time where the US cannot put together a government, or at least in the House of Representatives. The other thing is that Blinken went to Jordan on this, quote, diplomatic trip because the United States wants Jordan to house the 101st Airborne Division of the United States Army. The 101st Airborne is a highly trained war machine. It consists of maybe a little more than 10,000 troops. To put that in Jordan, and I don't know whether it's been agreed to and settled, means that it would be a strike force against Iran. And it would mean that the United States would be a part of a war between Israel and Iran, which means then that the war would not just be Iran versus Israel and the United States. It would mean Hezbollah, Hamas, who knows where it would go. But it could, again, bring the world closer to nuclear war. The other thing is that in the midst of all of this, the BRICS countries, Russia, Iran, and Saudi Arabia are carrying out diplomatic initiatives on their own. And this is highly significant. And that's why I think Blinken went on this trip to all of these Arab countries to try to explain the American position. I don't think he was too effective because he was in Israel first and running off at the mouth.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
All of that,
Yeah.
you know, BS. They heard it, they know what that represents. And of course the Saudi government, Mohammed bin Salman and them people, they're not down with the Biden administration at all. So we have alternative tracks of negotiation, and for the first time, the United States, the first time in over 50 years, maybe 70 years, that the United States is not the key diplomatic player in the Middle East. One might suggest the US might be being sidelined, and that Russia and the BRICS countries, BRICS plus 6 countries, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and potentially China will have the great weight in negotiation. First of all, when the matter is taken to the United Nations General Assembly and to the Security Council first and then the General Assembly, the majority, overwhelmingly of nations, will side with BRICS, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, in their initiatives for peace. And, by the way, a two-state solution, which is, I mean, I can't tell you the blow that this would be to the regime in Israel. Over the last 50 years, they have encroached more and more on Palestinian land, now in the West Bank, setting up these settlements. I mean, stuff that under international law is considered crimes against humanity, genocide, war crimes, on down the line, you know? Okay, I just want to end with this. The claim that Hamas carried out rapes, beheadings, random murders of individual Israelis. If all of that occurred, I don't think all of it occurred. There were excesses, I think, in the killing of civilians.
Yeah.
Were these the Hamas army, which is highly disciplined? I don't think so. I think this was an outpouring of anger once that wall was breached. You know, people literally from the hood went over in there and said, "You killed my mother, you killed my father." You know, and now, and this is where Frantz Fanon is very significant. The psychology of the oppressed and the psychology of the oppressor. In many ways, what looks to be the same, in essence, is not. Frantz Fanon is the Martinican psychiatrist who studied the Algerian War for National Liberation. And in two books, Black Skin, White Mask, and then in a book that he's best known for, Wretched of the Earth, he talks about how violence of the oppressed is a cleansing. I want to just focus upon the men of the oppressed group because they are targets for many reasons. We see it here among black men. They are humiliated. They are the poorest among the oppressed. They are the most humiliated. They're looked down upon even in their own communities. And so in Gaza, as in the United States, they take on certain pathological dysfunctional behaviors. One is to get strung out on alcohol or drugs or other things, which is kind of the slow death. I have nothing to live for. I ain't gonna get a job. I can't be educated. All I can do is hang out in the street. So a lot of people, and they have drugs over in Gaza, they become addicted to alcohol and drugs. The other thing is that the oppressed, especially the males, have high rates of suicide. Sometimes OD, sometimes straight up suicide. But the other side of this is, the other form of suicide is to kill another black man. I'm not worth shit, you ain't worth shit. You're gonna disrespect me, I'm gonna kill you, I'm gonna hurt you. That's in Gaza. That's over here. Maybe a little worse over here sometimes, but I don't know. The other form of behavior is to brutalize women. You know, that gender divide happens, and that's manufactured. You know, the same guy, I love my mother, but why are you beating your wife up like this? Because she didn't listen to me. Don't nobody respect me. You can hear it when you hear You ask a guy beating up his girlfriend or his wife, why'd you beat her up? Because I told her to do something and she didn't do it. Mm-hmm. You know, in other words, somebody has to hear that I'm going to be the man. I'm going to be a man, if nothing else, in my house. You know. But would you want somebody to do that to your mother? No, nobody better not do that to my mother. Well, but you see the dilemma, the paradox. All of these pathological and negative behaviors result from extreme poverty and degradation.
Yeah.
But then there is another alternative. That is violence directed against your oppressor. That's what Fanon talks about, and how it is cleansing.
Exactly.
You know what I'm saying?
Catharsis.
To cut the throat of the French occupier in Algeria.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? To kill him in the name of freedom. Fanon says it is cleansing.
Yes.
Now, but that is not the behavior of the disciplined revolutionary.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? That is the individual freeing and cleansing himself. And of course, when the violence is turned outward towards the oppressor, the young man that carries it out is celebrated in his community. Especially the women, the grassroots women. You know, yeah, you did right. Even if he dies, he's seen as a hero. Because he's not inflicting violence internally. Now, so one can clearly understand all of that now organized into a disciplined military force. And that's what we saw.
Exactly.
That's what we saw. Now, I just would end on this. While Fanon's diagnosis is absolutely right, the solution, I think, is closer to Baldwin. I don't want to go into that now, but Israelis and most Jews in the world have forgotten how to love. They know how to hate. They don't know how to love. They need Baldwin. The Israeli people need Baldwin more than they need air. What they have done to the Palestinians is hateful and evil.
Yes, it is.
You know what I'm saying? And so, in a large march, and in the front of it is Jewish Voices for Peace. They could easily have put Jewish Voices to Save Our Souls. Is this what we have become? My last point. There was an article in the Financial Times last week. I'll find it in a minute. Where this writer is asking the question, what does Israel do now? Now that we can no longer externalize our deep pathologies and say it's all because somebody over there forced me to do this. Hamas forced me to carry out these war crimes in Gaza. I had to do it. Now you can't look at, you have to look inward. What have the Jewish people become? And why does the world look upon them with utter contempt? Including here in the United States. I've often talked about this. But I'll stop there.
Can I just say one thing? I'm gonna say one thing.
Go ahead.
You know, when we're all involved in everyday daily life and the healing that we as individuals, when it's the collective, it's all of our neighbors and then our community. And but when it goes downhill, the way Tony was speaking, the downward projection is that the whole nation it's not the sickness and the crisis. It's a part of us. We don't want to face that form of reality where the conflict and the crisis is true. The healing part is to reconcile, like with Fanon, something about our behavior, on our own selves. Suicide, addiction, family abuse, all the abuses. And then the nation, in this particular episode, it's the nation is willing to carry out the abuse and use innocent children as the motive. Not the adult that died senior. They're taking the innocent child, portraying the child on TV. So it really it diminishes things that we think about the child. Everybody care about their children. And we won't really have no healing. Like we want to know if they really kill people or is this just something out of hatred.
That's right.
Making hatred. Yeah. But the healing part is people going to suffer the next weeks and the month. It's going to be a lot of personal suffering because the thing that you face in the mirror is that you willing to destroy your individual capacity to get up in the morning. People have they have the instant fear, like when you get up, like I'm crossing town, Tony crossing town. A lot of people won't cross town. Those people over there won't even go to the door. But the reality, what I'm saying is that it takes people like ourselves that give ourselves a moment to face our reality and not try to project like we're trying to make some hatred out of our free speech or the freedom of what we was born to be able to do. But for us to be healed when we get together, just a collective when I come here. This is something that everyone in some community going to have to come to terms with.
Two things hearing you talk, Doc, about, well, first of all, it was really clarifying. Everything you said, I think, really clarified what's happening, and in particular, Hamas and the Palestinian people. But the two things I thought about was its relationship to, like, not just the world, how the qualitative changes in the world, but also in particular how it's connected to the struggle in America. Because the last thing you said about Baldwin, Fanon's psychology, like Fanon is accurate in describing what happens to an oppressed people, especially the men of an oppressed people, but that it's not the solution, and that Baldwin is necessary for an oppressed people to find a way out.
And for the oppressor.
Because it reminded me of...
You remember Baldwin?
Yeah, because it reminded me of both Baldwin and King, though, because I feel like Baldwin's whole thing is, he says, it's especially in the letter to his nephew, where he says, I know it feels hard, you want to hate the white man, and you should, like, it's understandable why we all hate the white man, but you will need to realize that they need you, like, it will save you, and it's up to you to save them, to love. But there's something about also the connection to King, this thing about King and Baldwin give the individual, but also the people who are emerging, a path forward to save the soul of yourself and the soul of your oppressor, but also the soul of the nation, to achieve that nation. And I think that's why I got chills hearing you talk at the end about Fanon and then also Baldwin, because it also, I think there's something really important about the Palestinian people's struggle, because when you're talking about the Jewish Voice of Peace, but also like whether it's students at these universities or just young people in general who, especially Jewish young people in America, but also the world, who are seeing something in the Palestinian people's struggle and saying like, it's an existential thing. It actually in some ways, to take a stand for to oppose Israel and say it so outright, like you said, it says something about them wanting to save their own souls.
Right.
And then I think the connection to the student movement against Vietnam, I feel like the important thing in this time will be all these young people who feel that there's something so wrong happening to the Palestinian people, to say that it's Israel's fault for what has happened, to force the people into this position. I feel like it's important for young people to see that it doesn't just say something about Israel and Palestine, but actually it says something about America and yourself and your own struggle in America. Because that has forced you to even see something in Israel and Palestine. The fact that there must be something that's happening to you in America too. And I think that's like in some ways, because that's in some ways what happened with Vietnam, where what happened in Vietnam, like what the U.S. military was doing in Vietnam, what it ultimately did was it most importantly also showed the American people something about themselves, and the American people something about America, and that there's a contradiction that has to be resolved, or else, like King said, like we will burn in the flame. I don't forget how he said it, but that it will lead to the end of our souls, the end of the nation.
That's involved in the fire next time.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so, and that's, yeah, so I also appreciate the connection of that what we're seeing is also something similar to the Vietnam, what happened with the Vietnam War, because it also brings up the question of King and the people's movement.
Yeah.
Because the student anti-war struggle against Vietnam, what it had to do was it could only, in some ways, the existential crisis of these students who felt the need to take a stand against Vietnam, this existential crisis they had could only be resolved by joining with but also with the civil rights movement, with like emerging people's movement led by King.
Yes.
And so it also kind of makes you think about today in America, like a people's movement that is emerging but not yet defined, has not been given meaning by the people yet. Because I think the political rebellion that we see in the US and like the crisis of legitimacy, it's a people's rebellion that is still taking shape, but that all of these protests of young people and like young people feeling they need to take a stand, that their stand against Israel or for Palestine also requires, just require, even on an individual basis of an existential question, will require them to resolve something about the future of America. Yeah, and so that is all related to what we've been talking about people's movement and emerging people in America.
I just say something just to add on to what you're saying. I don't know the Jewish community, but it seems to me that several generations have been raised on hatred, and that they must hate most of the world because most of the world hates them.
Yeah.
But we must in particular hate the Palestinians. And at some point, Jews themselves are going to have to talk this out and atone before the world, but that's why they need Baldwin back.
Right.
They need Baldwin. But the other thing is, I was just going to say, every great political movement, if it is to be great, requires that spiritual, moral dimension. The weakness right now is that is missing.
Yeah.
That's all.
Well, because even when you were saying,
Go ahead.
one last thing is just like about Baldwin, when you said the Palestinians don't hate the Israelis or Israel because they're Jewish, they hate you because you are the oppressor. And it reminded me of Baldwin, when Baldwin said, Black people, we don't hate, we're anti-Semitic because we're anti-white. And it goes with what you said also about the whole identity of Zionists And it is a question of how much of it is not just Zionists, but Jewish people. The whole identity of Israelis and Zionists is this idea of everyone hates us, and so we have to, it's not just about like we're Jewish, it's we're the victim. And so it's an identity based around the necessity of a myth, of like we're the victim of the world's like evil, like and that one historical instance of evil defines us and who we are. And so we must always have, like, it's not just Palestinians, it's like, it's definitely at this point, they believe the Arabs hate us, and so we have to, it's like a identity, I don't know, I think there's something important about this identity. Sorry, Ransom.
Go ahead, Ransom.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I was very impressed with how accurate and well-researched your analysis was. And you even went into the psychology of it, which is very significant. It's very difficult to get accurate information about Israel. And it's also very difficult, even when you're armed with all kinds of very accurate information. It's very difficult for you to express or say anything against Israel in a public forum. The control that they have over the mainstream media, mainstream publishing, all of that. And it takes a lot of audacity or quote-unquote balls to do that. So I commend you. Another thing I'd like to say is that they have right next to them created a huge concentration camp. And have the audacity to present themselves as, I'm persecuted. You know, it's just, whew. That's, laughter is actually a brain function. Most people think, I'm laughing at something funny. No, real laughter is a brain function. It enables you to be vividly aware of all of the shit going on in the past and now, and not lose your mind. So with that, that's all I have to say.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to connect.
Speak up a little bit, yeah.
Wanted to connect what we're talking about with our discussion of the election. I think Biden and the Democrats' jump to brinkmanship and his parroting of Israeli propaganda really exposes Biden and the Democrats as pro-war. And I think people are increasingly fed up with that. And with what, Ransom, you're talking about, with the difficulty of getting accurate information about world events. And so that engenders a distrust of Democrats, with Biden coming up on this election, and of the mainstream media that we can't trust.
There's no question about it. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think also in understanding all of this is important. When I was talking to Samir, because he was explaining to me the history of Israel as well and the formation of the state, because prior to, I think, was in 1948, like it was just Palestine. But even with the creation of the state,
under the Ottoman Empire, and then under the British Mandate. And see, this is, if I you don't mind if I, you see the question of, and this is going to come up when we talk about Putin's speech about civilization, and civilization state.
Right.
Where do you draw the boundaries? And certainly after World War II, where, colonialism was weakened and the Ottoman Empire, which had ruled prior to World War I, is no longer there, but it's part of a British mandate now. Where do you draw the boundaries in that part of the world, which is a big question because it had been partitioned previously. But that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, and I think part of it is also this framing of being against Israel as being against like Judaism as well, because my understanding of it is that the formation of a state was not on the basis of Judaism, but actually a secular state.
Absolutely.
And so for those who say that being
Even
against...
socialist in many people's minds is separate.
and so that was one piece. And then I think the comparisons or the conversation around the psychology is important, because not only, it made me think a lot about Baldwin, because Baldwin to say that with the African American situation in America, people like to point, or white society likes to point to the Negro problem. But Baldwin is saying actually it's not the Negro problem, but a question of America, and it's all like both black and white. Yeah. And that's the same comparison that you're drawing to Israel and Palestine, because what actually does whiteness do, or what does it do to you to be an oppressor who becomes so arrogant and has to essentially gets off on humiliating, oppressing another group? And then that being connected as well, this tie between Israel and the United States is so important. Like, how is it that a minority group actually in an Arab area of the world is able to have this military financial power? And it is because it's backed by the US. In terms of military funding in general, the technocrats as well. Because I know even within pharma, there are huge ties to Israel. And in terms of research and like vaccinations, all of that. And that's why the American situation is so important, where as we talk about the American people becoming anti-war and intervening in the affairs in the rest of the world, this phenomenon of Trump and of the movement itself being in, like, within the House of Representatives that are against funding for Ukraine, like all of this is connected. Because even with the budget extension that happened, it was over this question of, do we continue funding Ukraine when we have so many problems here in America? And I think that also extends to Israel as well.
I think so.
Yeah, I also wanted to touch on that. I think, the past week has been a little bit surreal in some ways, because things moved so fast in the Israel-Gaza war. And I think part of what I am trying to make sense of is exactly how those impact the American political landscape, because I don't think it's going to be simple. I think it's almost like there are certain, I guess, vibes of 9/11 almost that are almost colliding with the anti-war, the general anti-war movement of the American people. And I think that there are going to be contradictions that emerge through that, and things that we need to understand in that sense. I also want to just say, I appreciated the way that you laid it out, especially the human element of it, and bringing in Baldwin, because the thing that has been very, I guess just in terms of the war itself, I was I feel like many people have been kind of transfixed in terms of trying to find just news and updates, and social media has made some things more accessible in terms of information, but it's also made many things more hazy and confusing and scary also, because of, there will be a report of Hamas beheading 40 babies, and it's you don't know where it comes from. I think part of the ironic thing is that, I agree that there probably have been excesses in terms of violence against civilians by Hamas, or just general Palestinian men and resistance fighters. But at the same time, it's the irony is that those are, the reports of those, I feel like most of them have not been confirmed. Whereas the war crimes that Israel is carrying out right now, or has already carried out, are literally being documented by like Human Rights Watch and the UN, like the use of phosphorus.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, the use of phosphorus. But also, I just think that there is a very particular dynamic in which it's much easier to almost like visually associate like this whole thing of like war crimes when it's like people shooting at each other directly as opposed to what Israel does, which is just carpet bombing. It removes the human element of the situation. So it's like if Israel carpet bombs Gaza or bombs like literally like says it's going to create humanitarian corridors for the people of Gaza to leave, but then bombs those corridors, it's like it's still I feel like it feels less almost immediate because it's like, oh yeah, they were just bombed. It's like they weren't like quote unquote beheaded, they weren't like shot, right? And I think that's part of I don't know, I just feel like part of it is just like the horrific aspect of war itself, which has been hard to digest, but also just hard to find accurate information because things moved so fast. And at the same time, like in terms of the domestic political situation, I think it is like very, I don't know, to me it feels complicated because I think to what you guys were talking about in terms of young people, young students, I feel like part of the challenge right now is that like basically the university left generation is having to realize that it cannot just basically conduct its politics through virtue signaling, and that actually when you take a stance on Palestine, it is a real political stance and there are consequences for it, but also by making that stance, you are basically committing yourself to like the actual ideological struggle of this country as well. Because part of the dynamic which I feel like is unfolding is that basically like the anti-woke, like the people who have been criticizing wokeness, all that stuff, especially like the media kind of thinker people, like the people who are also kind of associated as like the intellectual proponents, influencers of like the anti-establishment, anti-woke, maybe pro-Trump, like that whole sphere. And this is mostly stuff that you see on the internet, so it's hard to say like actually how things are playing out at a population level, but that they're basically, one, I think there are a lot of Zionists in that kind of sphere, and that they're also weaponizing basically the criticism of wokeness to be like, oh, these university activists are so woke that now they're justifying war crimes by Hamas. And that is, I think, part of the kind of the rhetoric that's unfolding in this, and at the same time, like, I think it is also triggering like a crisis and splits amongst basically like what you call the right, or basically the Trump movement, in which like people like Tucker Carlson take one stand, but then it's like, all these like, people like Ben Shapiro, very like intense about the whole situation. But yeah, I don't know. I agree that it's basically it'll be interesting to see how this unfolds. But part of it is I don't know, I just feel like there's a lot of uncertainty, especially in terms of whether this will escalate into a regional war. There's already been exchanges between Israel and Hezbollah and Lebanon, and like I think there's been a lot of protests, I think in Lebanon in particular, in terms of opening up the border.
And of course Jordan, big.
Can
I say something? See, this thing of Israel, Israel is literally a 51st state of the United States. This dual citizenship. I was a former ambassador from Israel to the United States, speaks with a Brooklyn accent. So he's, he doesn't even speak like a Hebrew or Yiddish speaker. So, these are so intertwined that the United States, and of course we want to talk about the Biden administration and this because it is electioneering, but it's a thing of whiteness. I think somebody said, what happens when the Jews become white completely? The other thing is it's a question of the the strategic interest, the Middle East, the oil, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and how Israel was agenda on. And the Israeli people are now asking themselves, are we prepared to die in fighting to the last Israeli for U.S. interest?
Yeah, there is, I mean, there's been a lot of reporting about what it will look like if the IDF goes into Gaza, and it's going to be...
And that's a big if right now.
Yeah, it's going to be, if they go in, it will be really ugly, because, and it will be, I think, catastrophic for Israel in particular,
Tell me why you
because
say catastrophic.
basically, the way, like Gaza, I was reading this article on, I think, foreign policy, but it's saying like Gaza is one of the most densely populated areas in the world. Also, ironically, like the most heavily surveilled square footage in the world, and yet they missed this. But that part of it is that it's hugely dense. It's like the neighborhoods are really packed together. And so, I mean, part of what Israel's trying to do is like, we're going to carpet bomb them to basically lay the ground for us to go in. But that you're going to, like, the way that the IDF would have to move is you're going like house by house.
Yeah.
It's not going to be like we're going to run in there. No, you have to go house by house here, because also it's almost like there's an impossible situation facing Israel in that their stated goal is to eliminate Hamas, right? Which ironically they had actually, I think I'd seen reports that Israel had actually fostered Hamas early on because they wanted to drive a division within the Palestinian movement, and that it's actually kind of similar to the situation of the Taliban, but that they had kind of fostered Hamas in order to drive a wedge and to also oppose the Fatah, I think, which was led by Yasser Arafat, and so it's partially just like the irony of this whole situation, but that like you have no idea who is like Hamas, you have no idea who are civilians, and that's partially why they've just become so blatantly genocidal in their language of Palestinians are human animals and we will treat them accordingly. But that it's not going to be like a quick victory to defeat Hamas. You would literally have to take over Gaza. But then the irony of that then is like, oh no, like the Israelis don't want to take over Gaza. They don't want to administer the Palestinians. So really the only solution would be to kill all of them, basically. And so
we'll come to a negotiated settlement of
It's tough neighborhoods. I'm going to say, I'm not a tough guy, but if you was coming through Philadelphia in the 60s and you say, on 35th, or they're going to go into a neighborhood, they're going to be like, wait, we're going to have to go carry a lot of people going there. They couldn't just ride, and we're not political, everybody not political, and everybody might not be in the mosque. But if you want to go to like 29, like me and Tony might be talking, or you went to the projects, 4th and Washington, and you had to like think about how many squad cars we need. You really got to come there with a lot of stuff. And they didn't want to provoke the rest of the city like that sometimes, because our neighborhood, like, they would get the brothers to go to Vietnam because they knew that we came from Chicago, Brooklyn, and they say they got a whole platoon of us go from Brooklyn, or you got people from Philly, South Philly, they might be in line. Like my brother was in line, so they knew they had black brothers in Vietnam that came from, deep neighborhoods, Plasky Town and Brick, all these neighborhoods. These people, we was running the streets like we would have been an army, but it's still gangs that had respect for how I was, how Tony was, and a lot of brothers that come across Columbia Avenue, Morocco. There's a lot of gangs that made up families. But you're gonna ride through Damascus. I could go to Damascus. Us people trying to fight me to go to Libya in the 70s. They said, you come in our neighborhood, you're gonna be with us. We're gonna be in the underground. We already live in the underground. We already know a lot of things. Our music.
See, and this is very important.
Sure.
And this is why, we can readily understand Gaza. It's first of all, and this is the sociology of it. When you talk about what we see on the streets of Philadelphia, broken young black men, no jobs, no education, no sense of a future, you know.
Prison rate.
Yeah, and a high prison rate.
You just make it prison rate.
That's right, and to leave a community of women and children.
Yeah.
Well, you know, yeah, I mean, women raise great children. I'm not going to, that's not the point.
Yeah.
But when there are no men anywhere.
You wiped us out, like me, like
That's
out,
right.
like the
That's
level where my age is right now. I'm 71. When I go through all the neighborhoods that I travel through, and people that I know, only a few the old is where I came from, and everybody else neighborhoods from the whole Germantown. And I pull out, and somebody pulled a yearbook out on me, and we was in a club at a party, and the boys from another corner I know, they said, "You in the yearbook with everybody." This was in another neighborhood, and I said, everybody in that book, they was like, they done it, they did. We was going through the 6th grade yearbook and looking at faces of people that died between 10th grade, 12th grade.
See, this
and
is,
you go to every
this is
neighborhood like that.
very important, and hence, you know, yeah, I don't want to
Genocide.
but yeah, it's a genocidal thing,
Genocide.
and it's to break down and destroy a community, to humiliate the men, to make them not respected by their wives or partners or children, and so there's so many things. But I think, and this is the great achievement, the battlefield militarily and politically shifted. And this, I think we should keep our eyes on this. And it is similar or analogous to the Vietnam, the Tet Offensive. You know?
There's a lot of
And to,
tunnels
I'm
underground.
sorry.
No.
No, you go ahead. You can go
No,
first.
it's like, I was learning that there's a lot of tunnels.
Oh,
built in
And
Vietnam.
the Viet Cong did the same thing.
Oh, yeah.
This is part, you know, and of course the carpet bombing of Korea,
Yeah.
you know, and that type of thing. This is, but it never wins. The carpet bombing of Iraq, the carpet bombing of Afghanistan, you know, and then always to create an alternative to the National Liberation Forces. Go ahead,
The
Jim.
last thing I wanted to add is the mentality, I think, of the Israelis in terms of, it's really weird because I grew up in Texas in kind of conservative school, and it was a Christian school, so I like had Bible classes and stuff. But like it's really funny because I remember I was taught that basically Israel was the only democracy in the Middle East, and that like they were surrounded by all these countries that wanted to kill them. But the funny thing is that it's not one-to-one, there's a correlation between the mentality that has been fostered, I think, amongst the Israelis with other countries like South Korea, for instance. In that it's
Or South Africa during apartheid.
But it's specifically in the mindset of the South Koreans feel that they are surrounded by enemies. And that they need then basically the protection of the United States in order to survive. But it's like this mentality of like, oh, we Koreans have always been oppressed, like we're surrounded by all these bigger powers, we're surrounded by our enemy in North Korea, and so that means like, oh, like we need to have the US here in order to protect ourselves. But it's like this mentality that was cultivated by imperialism to make you feel like you're perpetually one victim, but also that you literally need the backing of the United States in order to justify like your own existence. Like I don't know how connected it is, but I think there is a correlation.
I think there's
Because I also thought about Korea when Doc was talking, because not just because of the shared, it's the common struggle, people struggle, like asymmetric warfare, but also because of like the commonalities in the military. Because the part of the issue with Israel is also it has required military service, and so your military is also made up of young people who have been taught that they don't really know what war means. so the military is abstract. War and military is abstract.
Yep.
And so it's also, your soldiers may not even be prepared psychologically to fight for a country they don't know is defined by what. And it's the same thing, I feel like there's commonalities in South Korea too, where it's a requirement, but no one really knows what war means totally. And that's also why when you're talking about how Hamas, there's a split, the thing is that Israel is not a consolidated country as well. Like the people of Israel, clearly there are splits in what they want. And that's also, in some ways, it's the irony of the human factor too, where it's like it's the whole king thing of what happens to a society or country based on a lie. I guess it's Baldwin too. But logically, the way human development happens is there has to be a reconciliation, or there has to be it can't hold, the center cannot hold. Right. And so same thing in Israel, and also it will definitely happen in Korea too, which is like what happens when, okay, you've had decades of a lie, you've been able to maintain decades of a lie, like military requirement, but the people are still people, and the people will always have a brain and a soul and consciousness. And so there will reach a point at which, like you guys have been talking about, even with your article, the Koreans in South Korea will say, why are we split again? Your generation, going to be generations beyond the Korean War of the immediate trauma. And so I also thought about Korea too. Because clearly someone in Israel has been helping.
Yeah, I think so.
Has been helping Hamas to, various degrees. It's not as simple as like a leak, but so it's the same in all places, similar to that. Like even with North and South.
This is so interesting because I think this is quite relevant to the idea of a lie and the vulnerability of a people who've been brought up on a lie, who've internalized a lie. So you have to continue to lie in order not to fracture your own sense of who you are.
Right.
And this is a question being raised by Jewish scholars, Hebraic scholars, scholars of the Torah, and Islamic scholars. Is Israel a, quote, Jewish state?
Right.
I.e., is it a state based upon the teachings of Judaism?
Oh, man.
Or is it a Zionist state, which means it has nothing to do with Judaism, but the political ambitions of certain cultural nationalists of Eastern Europe? But I think Baldwin helps us tremendously, because which might be happening, if this is a existential crisis in the sense of culture, civilization, and on and on and on, if it is that, then the undoing of that means the undoing of a state based upon a lie. And I just want to, is it a Jewish state as advertised, or is it a Zionist state? A Jewish state would mean a state not just made up of people who allegedly practice Judaism, which most Israelis don't, and don't claim to be more secular.
Right.
Or is it a Zionist state? Is it, you know what I'm saying? And the difference, there has to be a separation. A Christian nation, quote unquote, as the United States is sometimes called, is a nation based upon the Bible or the New Testament, old and new, but certainly. Or is this a democratic bourgeois state? I mean, but for Israel, I think it will be a deep unraveling. And for American Jewry,
Wow.
it has to be, because that's a huge investment. To be a Jew in the United States almost means to be a supporter of Israel. And why should that be? Why, in order to be a Jew, must I support Israel?
Right.
Why? So they've conflated Judaism and Zionism.
Exactly.
And they're two completely different things.
Just to jump in on it, because the concept of people of the book, like when this happened, that was like, and we talked about it, like that was the first thing. Because I was thinking about the consciousness of the disciplined fighters. What is the consciousness? What do they rely on? And so that's deep. And the way that you also, talked about the mosque.
Al-Aqsa.
Al-Aqsa. What people are, Derek, you already pointed out, we all talked about it, what the Palestinians are fighting for. Well, it's like the same thing. They know what their enemy is in that case. But I'll leave that whole conversation. What I'm bringing the people of the book up for is because, there's just a lot to be worked out. And the other thing in my mind is the qualitative and quantitative changes, historical changes that have, either occurred, qualitative changes that occurred because of the move that Hamas and the fighters had made. And then, because to me it seemed that ultimately, actually, yes, the whole question of the quote-unquote Middle East had to be faced by BRICS and was also working itself out, whether with Saudi Arabia and others, either involvement of BRICS. And then, yes, I could imagine, too, that the development of these areas possibly, and this is just me thinking, just in the hypothetical, after stages of conflict, that China would be one of the leaders to help any of the areas or whatever area to develop.
It's hugely significant
Which is
for China and Russia to have the diplomatic initiative in an area of the world where the U.S. had assumed that everybody else get back, we got this. So you got this long, drawn-out process between Israelis and Palestinians, which kind of ended, but it was, and they always were in talks, but nothing gets resolved because the United States was militarily so invested in Israel and was not impartial. China, if it came in, Russia, Saudi Arabia, they would be more impartial. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, but in that same case, the United States would have to pull back.
Absolutely. Well, no question.
And, the whole question of the presidency, maybe a couple of years of self-development actually would matter for the American.
Say that again.
A couple of years of self-development for the American state to reacclimate or, adjust to this whole new world situation.
That's it.
Is also on the table. But then another.
Does everybody understand what Sarah's just saying?
Meaning, when, I don't know how specifically Trump will involve himself with this question of war and peace, which is the ultimate question and the first and foremost question for this country in order for it to engage and develop, this whole question of the peace economy. What is the way that industry and the economy will itself run? How will the people interact with each other and so on and so forth? But that also means the way that I'm used to him talking about conflict is a certain diplomatic relationships, okay, we're still gonna do us thing and y'all do y'all situation. So I don't like to think that Trump has interest in the whole Israel conflict is kind of disappointing to me.
Well, but it is disappointing. And can I just say something? I looked at and it's worth looking at, I think. Max Blumenthal, who is a young journalist, not so young maybe, but he was on this podcast.
I think I saw it.
Did you see?
Briefly,
And he talked about, first of all, he talked about the family lineage of Anthony Blinken and how deeply connected he is to Zionists and wealthy Zionists. But the other thing is, and this, I think, this is where the break is about to happen. Just like these wealthy donors to Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania or Harvard, who's saying that, well, you tell us who those students are who signed that petition, or else we're going to cut off aid.
Wow.
Oh, can you now, you think everybody is for sale?
Right.
Just because Al Sharpton is for sale, that don't mean
That's right.
but this is, see, that is that arrogance. And with Trump, it was Sheldon Adelson, the guy that owns these casinos out in Las Vegas, who helped to fund Trump's campaign in return for supporting Netanyahu and breaking out of the Iran nuclear deal. You know what I'm saying? Now, Trump is going to have to come to terms with, are you for sale?
Come on. Yeah.
Or are you going to stand principally in certain ways? And this is, we don't know.
Yeah. But I'm just thinking about the people of the book again, because the historic remaking of the world, and the price of it all. But it's something very profound in my mind that I think if artists are paying more attention, like this whole epoch remaking thing will make Michelangelo kind of like sit down and for a second, because there's definitely new plays and everything can be rewritten in my mind. But you know, all throughout this week I was just like thinking, but what the people of the book, like prophetic, the civilizational, like we'll talk about it. I don't mean to jump, but what that awesome, like in this remaking, it's very palpable, and like I just think that right now it's all on the line for so like the arc of everything is on the line. Like people, like I can imagine like one of my cousins who's living in Israel. I was telling this to a couple of people who were asking, but like, you know, I was just fantasizing. This young boy was cut, like, okay, first of all, preference. My cousin cut me off like years ago because she was like, you're posting about Palestinians, yeah. And I was just like, you know, it hurts me because your family. And like she would look at my Facebook, after she cut me off, maybe a year or so later to see if I was the same, and I was. And she was like, I'm so disappointed in you. I can't believe, you know what I mean? And I was just like, well, I'm glad that you're checking in to see if I'm okay. But what's so funny is that, like, you know, I'm having conversations with my dad and whatnot, so it'll be a whole mess. But the thing about my cousin is that she has 2 kids. One is an IDF soldier, I think, and I think he's maybe like now 15 or 16 or something. But like, I was also expressing this situation because I feel like my family in general are just very, you know, passionate people, because she is in Israel. She chose to go, and she is an extremist. She's defending Israel on the lines of, you know, I guess religion and political and Zionist.
And can I just say something? This is very, I hate to interrupt.
No, it's okay.
You're talking about the book.
Right.
And for the Jews,
Which
it
book?
is the Torah.
Right.
And so if you are people of the book, when does Zionism come in?
And how does it come into
And how, hold on a minute. But see, this, I want to just kind of tease this out and explore it. The question becomes, and I say this again, is this a Jewish state or is it a Zionist state?
Right.
And what happens to the long history of peace and humanity, which comes from the Torah, not from Zionism?
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? So,
I see, yeah.
so all of this emotion and fury that you often see among Jews, especially more among American Jews and Israeli Jews, that everybody's an anti-Semite. Oh, you don't like Israel? Oh, you're an anti-Semite. Oh, you're fighting for, oh, you're an anti-Semite. You know, this smearing and demeaning of people who differ with you politically. Because one, it is not, again, it is not your religion, it is your politics.
Right.
And this is the bad faith that you see exercised among Jewish people in America. You see, where they have fed into the Zionist narrative and abandoned Judaism.
Whereas in America,
Isn't that fair? Would you say?
100%. And whereas in America, you see with King and the civil rights, like that time, this birth or rebirth,
Right.
a re-understanding, a remaking of civilization and the book, the understanding of Jesus and all that, nonviolence and the struggle. But anyway, in the thought experiment, I was like, you know, if I were to talk to my cousin that I never talked to since I was like maybe 10, I haven't seen him, like say at like my grandma's house, and we were just like there talking, the possibilities of that happening. I thought at first understanding this problem were limited, but now with our discussion is that, you know, the whole question is on the generation to come and on my generation also, about this remaking of civilization itself based upon peace and it's very palpable. So if I were to have a conversation with him, if he's not already dead, I don't know anything about what's going on with him. It would be an event that I think will also occur throughout this moment in time, where there's these crossings, like people are seeing in new ways, and there's new possibilities of understanding oneself completely.
There's no way to get around it.
I want to say
Well,
something.
let me let Branson and then Derek.
All right, real quick, and I'm finding this very interesting. And thanks for the insights and whatever.
Just speak.
Real quick, going back real quick, I went to the library to get a particular book written by a Russian Jew called The 13th Tribe. I would see the book listed, and it was never there. I had to buy the book. I bought the book and read the book. I said, wow. Come to find out, the Jews descend from the Khazar tribes, and they converted, and they had the year that they converted to Judaism. Now, they were trying to find land, a homeland, any way they could find it. They was even trying to take Uganda at one time. They built the airfield at Entebbe, and for some reason, the West would not support them there. And they said, we want to support you in the Middle East to keep that area safe for Western interests or whatever that was. And then all of a sudden, then they spin the whole mythology that we're going back to take back our but they're not. They're not the people of the book.
No.
And that's why that particular book, written by a Russian Jew, why that book was suppressed.
But there's another book.
I'm not going to remember his name.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's called The 13th Tribe.
Or the book, The Moses Mystery, which traces monotheism back to the Egyptian pharaoh.
We know that.
So, but go ahead, Derek.
So I'm just basing off of Sarah because it put that feeling on me when if I'm looking in the Quran And the Quran opens with the people of the book, the Jews and the Christians are closer to us. This is a ayat or verses in the Quran because it's letting you know, these are the people of the book. It says the Muslims, the Jews, and the Christians being closer, so that people of the book could be learned about. And all the Muslims worldwide, or anybody that ever read in the Quran to read that, like I go into church, and the prophet was saved by the Ethiopian head of Ethiopia, and there was nowhere else for him to run to. They had to go flee to Ethiopia. And the Ethiopian king told the persons that were chasing them from out of Arabia, y'all can't take them from nowhere. The ambassador from the prophet told the king of Ethiopia, the king of Ethiopia drew something on the floor and said, they closer to me than this, so you can take them nowhere. But the people of the book is not some suspense.
No. This is very important, and this is why when we get to civilization and what Putin is doing or saying, it's going to be very interesting. Yes. But this is important only to the extent of the mythology of the state of Israel. And once you separate the truth from the mythology, then you can see more clearly. And of course, to know Zionism is not Judaism.
Right.
It is, in many ways, it's not even close to being Judaism. And so to say that the world is anti-Jewish, as though the state of Israel is the defender of Judaism, it's a lie. It's a complete lie, and it causes a kind of a psychological problems among Jews, because for all kind of reasons, I don't have to go into the tease of that, but it's very obvious that these people are on very thin ice right now, and the whole house of cards could collapse at any minute. But go ahead, Sarah.
One of the reasons that spurred me to think about the people of the book is even just that concept is because God is with the oppressed.
Well, see, that's the other thing. That's the other thing. How I'm sorry. Yes.
Well, because
in all religions, including the Torah, everything.
But because the feeling, I'm just concerned about the feeling of the people, because no people have gone through slavery like Black people have. And what that also means is no people have seen the pain and suffering in the same vein, or what that, that brings up that civilizational base that stems all the way to Africa, and it's and it was a shock to the world also, the whole event of slavery. How could it be possible? Is it seen? Is it real? Is this something that's actually happening? But then still same comes true to the events that happened also on Saturday. Is it also true? What are these deaths? What do that mean? Who are these people and what are they fighting with? And
on Saturday.
Or whatever, exactly that. But that's that base, and as many people that will die, as many a child will be born in the future that will also need a future. And so what future will be, how are they fighting for, what do they see of the future, and how? So
they use the story of the baby, just like in the Quran, it's a chapter with Mary in the chapter in the Quran. It's one of the longest chapters in the Quran. Now, I'm not going to go into interpretation about it, but I'm so attached to the mother and the Mary story. But they would take a child and use that child as it's like the child is like the immortal of living.
The immortal child.
Yeah, but you don't want to kill a child and then say, we didn't kill him. And I wouldn't say, well, would they lie to the world like that? You know what I mean? Because of what the child plays and like Sarah, what you mentioned, the prophetic language of the child is different from like the language of abuse.
Of a what? Of
The
a priest.
prophetic language of the child. Because you see a lot of them, I look at all the Madonnas, you walk in the church, you see the Madonna, she's holding the child. So everybody have a culture where she's holding the child. You don't see too many people destroy these icons either. Now in the Islamic world, they don't go in there and just knock that down. They will support that. They might go do it in an injustice. But so Jerusalem, I'm just saying it to you, Jerusalem is like the microcosm of the city of the world. Like it's written anywhere. I'm not making this up. But so that the Christians, the Jews, and the Muslims, they should be able to come there free because this is the sacred space like anywhere in the world. I don't care who you live at. So I went to Zion Baptist Church as a little kid. Reverend Leon Sullivan church.
I never saw you.
It's on every avenue. Well, I'm just saying, I wouldn't even think about Zion Baptist, like somebody said Zion, they'll say, what did they talk about, Zion Baptist Church? You know, taking something that churches name with. That was strange for me, but if somebody took it and say, why would they Zion? I said, my grandmother goes to Zion Baptist. Why would they use Zion as somebody toward the country up? Anyway, somebody absurd. Somebody has
and like you said, but you see,
somebody absurd the name.
You know,
in
in the free school, we have people who are from different religions. I know for the Hindus in the house, it's a very, difficult thing to understand. And like I'll never forget Emily saying her mother took her to the library when she was a child and she saw the Bible. She thought it was a book of stories and fiction.
Oh.
You remember you said that? So I would say for those who are not raised in the Judeo-Christian, Muslim, or Abrahamic religions, a lot of this is unfamiliar, and I can understand.
Exactly.
And thus, this is very James Baldwin.
It is.
This is something, just like you say, between black people and the Jews as white people. When the Jews become white, it's qualitatively different then. They join the oppressor.
Yep.
They have. I mean, the Jews of today are not the same as the Jews, let's say, of 1908, as immigrants from Russia, Poland, or whatever. This is a different narrative, a different identity, a different class positioning, and so on.
I would take on, I'm sorry for speaking, I would take on, I'm looking at Serafina because when I was her age and younger, most of the people that was in the movement, I could be in a gang of guys everywhere. They'd look through the crowd, let me talk to you, please. Let me talk to you. So I kind of had a voice. I couldn't tell the gang what to do all the time, but sometimes I'm supposed to say, that's how I get my confirmations. I can't look, I'm listening to Tony because he's a person of wisdom. He has grown in front of me because I spent a lot of years being with him at the free school. If the person don't have to see me, but I'll keep my notes about what he's doing. But that keeps my recognition of how that is. And Serafina came to
what he's saying is
young.
He's going back to the streetwise, and he's seeing me as an OG.
Yes.
That my respect from a street level is based upon what I know. That's just that this hierarchy, and he's right. Can I just say this? I just want to explain that he is saying that even among gangs, so-called gangs, the street world, there's a hierarchy where knowledge is respected. When knowledge is respected, and I was going to go into jazz, so we'll get to that later. But I'm sorry.
So that gives young people. Well, for me, it gave a young person to have the right, even if I was with an older, cruel teacher. I don't want to be steered wrong either. You know what I mean? It was a lot of things that was steered to me. At least I was at that level where the old heads or people that I was with women and men, they spoke to me a little bit. They ain't speaking to me all day, but I'm supposed to be sitting here with younger people representing what that felt like. Somebody got to keep the momentum up.
That's right.
This is a tackle fight. This is hard tackle. Some people can't be tackled and get back up. Sometimes you get tackled by, and you can't get up. Sometimes if you do get up, somebody will say, I thought you was gonna go down. I ain't going down nowhere. You want to go down, I'm gonna show you down anyway. But it's a language for my style of living.
Right.
I can't falsify it.
Right.
But if somebody says something about the people of the book, my mother said, Derek is sitting in the front row. I don't care where he go at. I don't care if it's the mosque, temple, wherever. He gonna be like, oh, I heard that. I seen that. Because we bring recognition to Tony been around the world too. There's not a lot of people I wouldn't even say that to Chico. And to be a type of strong survivor of not like the worst contest. This thing going over in Palestine, old heads came and got me, took me to the Red Crescent in the 70s. Because I was a young person that they saw in the neighborhood, like, yo, you could come with us and ride to New York. Old heads from PLO, you can come up here with us and see what our young people got to do to survive. And they up in there in real kind of neighborhoods. We're a product of what the Palestinians is.
That's true.
And they're a product of what we are.
That's right. More than the Palestinian movement over here even understand.
Yeah.
But let me hey Derek, let us kind of end this part because I know Jerry and Nuri gonna have to leave.
I know, it's just me.
How's that again?
Just
Oh, just Jerry. Okay. Because but they want to report on Putin's civilization state concept, but it will. But see, he has to leave in a little while. But go ahead.
I just wanted to say,
Samir.
real quickly, because Jeremiah pointed out, how Israel fostered Hamas. Anywhere you see Islamic extremism, it's usually fostered by the U.S. or Israel. Israel supported Al Qaeda in Syria. They gave physical aid. They were in Israeli hospitals in the Golan Heights, and the U.S. supported the Muslim Brotherhood. But Hamas today, they were elected in 2006, and then Israel gave aid to Fatah so they would fight a civil war, and Hamas, it was a master stroke, and Hamas has already won because this is a leftover from 48 and the anti-colonial struggle, and Arab countries have always said that we have to resolve this before we resolve any other issues, before relations are normalized. And America was trying to bypass the Palestinian issue by normalizing relations with Saudi Arabia, and so Hamas, reasserted the Palestinian question, and there's no doubt they would win an election again. And it just goes to show how this relates to the multipolar world, and the Palestinian question is at the forefront. The Palestinian struggle, national identity is at the forefront against, racism. It's not just the concentration camps in Israel, it's the re-education camps of Ethiopian Jews in Israel. People don't really know Israeli society because it's all a lie. And I just wanted to end on that what this conflict did by damaging, those negotiations with Israel and Saudi Arabia, pushed Saudi Arabia and Iran together, and finally, it's America's fault. America was in the path of the two-state solution, the internationally recognized solution to the conflict. When people say, "Oh, well, what should we have done?" Well, let me tell you what you should have done. Recognize the internationally recognized solution to the conflict, and
Could we just see what some comments are, and then we'll go to Jerry and Nuri, and I think all of this folds back. We'll fold back into it.
Okay, so there were a lot of comments. There are a lot of comments. Quite a lot of people were watching during your presentation. I think on Facebook in particular, there were like 150 people-ish watching.
Wow.
It's usually like 11.
We usually have like 20 to 30 total over Facebook and YouTube. But today it reached, I think, around 200 at peak. So a lot of people were listening and I think have followed the page as well. And it was from like, I think kind of all over. Like there are a lot of Americans, but also people from the Philippines and around the world. I think people are really, think like this is very much on people's minds. And yeah, I think also because there are some, I think like Trump people who follow our page, it seems like there were some comments that were very pro-Israel, but also very pro-Palestine. And yeah, I think I'm not going to read all of them. I think people, you know, want peace, but also, yes, some people are very pro-Israel. Some people are saying actually it's the United States that is the terrorists. Brother Jerome says that he, I guess, honors our principled stand and wants to also share about Brianna Joy Gray talking about the discussion on Gaza. And yeah, I think if you're interested in the comments, it's good to just read them directly because there's a lot happening. Yeah, but I think basically what's happening is so grotesque and so, I think, violent that basically it does force you to take a moral stand. Like it's a very moral question. And I think especially the way that you framed it where it's like, what will happen to like basically the soul of Jewish people or even the American people in general if you don't take the right stand? Because yeah, when you see just the carpet bombing that's happening and the fact that Israel like cut off Gaza's electricity and water and supplies and is basically telling the entire north have to evacuate when it's already so dense, like there are huge repercussions of that. And also the fact that on average like the people in Gaza are so young, like on the average, like they're 18, 19, and so you're carpet bombing literally the youth and children. And I think we know from like history with the Vietnam War and the Korean War, when that happens to people, like you can never forget it. And I think also the world is watching and like you can't forget or like, you'll just remember what's happening now. And so, yeah, I feel like this conversation was really deep and it just shows that like in America too, like we do have to take a stand on it.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt the conversation.
No.
But yeah, this was something that I guess we had like originally picked up on last week with Putin's speech at the Valdai Club, which is an annual forum in Russia, in which basically the Russian leadership engages with like the rest of the world. And so Putin gave remarks like many other figures in like the Russian state, also like Lavrov also spoke. I think Medvedev also spoke. But anyways, the most important things from this speech, which I think also pertain to like our discussion today, is basically Putin made the point that, first of all, to go back to like, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, that the Russia-Ukraine war was not about Russia's quest for territorial expansion. He was like, Russia is already the largest geographic country in the world, like we don't need more territory. It's like we already have all these other territories like in Siberia that like we need to focus on developing. So for us, it's not a question of territorial expansion. But then the more interesting part, which also gets to what we were talking about, is the concept of civilization, and specifically what Putin raised as the concept of the civilization state, in which he says in Russia's official foreign policy concept, they say that Russia is characterized as an original civilization state, and he uses very precise language. Original people. And that this is also, it's not just a question for Russia, but also a question of international relations as well. And so, I guess like, yeah, both of us can kind of give like a summary and thoughts on it, but what stood out to me was basically that first of all, he's saying that like a civilization state is like obviously rooted in a much longer history of a people. It's characterized by like the diversity also of a people. Like a civilization is not like a homogenous thing, but like rather encompasses like could encompass like different nationalities and all that, which is true for Russia. Also true for India, for instance. And that also one of the other distinguishing factors of civilization, at least according to Putin, is that it is characterized by self-sufficiency. And so he kind of draws from that to say that basically the importance of civilization in this time is that like he contrasts it with the history of Western colonialism, in which he's like, there used to be a concept that only certain people held the right, like only certain people had achieved civilization, and that therefore they needed to like impose this on the rest of humanity, which is basically the concept of Western hegemony, of Western domination, the age of Europe, that whole thing. But that now what we're reaching is like an age in which many, like all of the world civilizations have the opportunity to develop as their own civilization while still sharing ideas, sharing culture, obviously sharing trade, I guess also, but that it is important to recognize that like each civilization also has its own history, and that it can draw from this history for its own future development. And then the concept of the state is brought in that he says like it's very important for like the modern civilization state to be like strong and to be self-sufficient and to not be susceptible to being kind of overdetermined by basically the West. And I think like for me, I guess part of where it's like it's very interesting because we've been talking in the free school for a very long time about civilization, and particularly Du Bois and Robeson's kind of theorization of civilization. And I think part of I don't even know if it's so much a criticism, but where I think it's almost like there's like a global space for dialogue that is opening up right now around the concept of civilization in this time, and what it means as a modern concept, which we're also writing about in Avant Garde for the first issue, but that Putin has to take a certain position because he like simultaneously is like, he has to in some ways distance himself from the Soviet experience to some degree, and Lenin, and at the same time invoke the memory of the Soviet people in resisting fascism, right? And so it's kind of an interesting position that Putin is in. And so during the Valdai Club discussions, Putin was asked do you think that it's time for Russia to kind of reassess particularly the Soviet period? And he's like, yes, there should be a reassessment of it, but also he's like, the Soviets thought that everything essentially was reduced to class relations and class struggle. And that he's like, actually for us, like in terms of international relations, it's more important to look at geopolitics rather than class struggle as the lens through which to understand even a concept like imperialism, for instance. Because famously, Lenin, the theory of imperialism is also the theory of capitalism, right? And of the development of capitalism. And so, yeah, that's part of the crux of the issue where Du Bois and Robeson, they almost complete this concept of civilization in which civilization is not divorced from class and class struggle, but it's actually almost like the merging of these concepts and the achievement of basically like a new stage of humanity. Whereas Putin, I think, is a little bit more, he has to take I guess maybe safer political stances just given his own, whatever the Russian political situation is. And so he would more try to separate this concept of class struggle and civilization, which I feel like in the free school we're very invested in finding the synthesis of it.
Yeah, it was a pretty interesting framing because there's a speech that Putin gave at Valdai, which there's a full transcript of, but then they also had a panel discussion on Russian civilization through the centuries. And I didn't listen to all of it, but in the framing, it was sort of like there was a moderator and then there were three speakers and they were kind of speaking all to one another. And I think the way that moderator had framed that discussion initially was that okay, like civilization is a concept that's important to discuss. In this time, like we have to do it. And he was like, many intellectuals have done it. Like he mentioned like Fernand Braudel, Samuel Huntington.
You mentioned Braudel?
Yeah, like so it was like more of a reference just to say like, oh, everybody has been thinking about it and it's important in this time. And okay, I want to just read a little bit of it because I think the word choice and also where like the specifics of it I think are very interesting. Okay, so the concept of civilization, as we know, is not new and is an intellectual discourse. It has many manifestations from Danilevsky to Braudel right up to Samuel Huntington. But I believe that concepts and categories are weapons in the battle of ideas, and they cannot be abstracted from the moment in which we live.
Right.
Civilization is a very important concept, and the civilizational vector, if I may call it that, of history and international development is important to our understanding of history and politics. But I raise the question as to the status of the civilizational vector. Is it one of several vectors, as I think, or is there a tendency to use the civilizational vector used like the class vector was in the past period, as a mass key or a master key, which leads to seeing everything through the prism of class, which finally leads to class reductionism. And I want to caution that the civilizational vector can be used to enrich our discussion and understand the complexity of human affairs, but not to use it as a master key. And so this discussion was interesting because I think it was more like multiple individuals and intellectuals kind of trying to hash it out and sort of, I don't think that the concept has been perfected or crystallized into like fixed form, but I just thought that that sort of vignette. What?
Where's the speaker?
I actually think he might have been Indian, but I'm not completely sure.
Indian stuff.
I'm not totally sure. Don't quote me on that. I need to go look at it. But yeah, like it's just really interesting because on the one hand, I thought it was really interesting that they're directly, explicitly saying that civilization is a category and a concept that is crucial to the ideological struggle right now, and that ideological struggle is incredibly important to politics and basically the direction that the world will move in. And so I think that identification is really significant. But that's also why I was kind of disappointed in Putin, to be honest, because if the civilizational concept is so important, I feel like it's actually very critical to have the correct assessment of the Soviet Union in that time. And I think that if you're trying to talk about the civilization state, I actually think thinking about the Soviet Union as sort of a prototype, or as at least like part of that continuity, is so important to establishing Russian civilization. And so, yeah, and I think Jeremiah, like you talked about how the class reductionism thing, or like trying to say that class and civilization are separate. Like I think, you know, like there's a lot that's in movement, and maybe it's not determined completely. It needs to be hashed out, but I feel like the direction that they're moving in, trying to establish civilization as not about class, I find a little bit worrying in a bit a way, because I just don't think that you can summarize the Soviet experience and the history as like, oh, it was class reductionist. And I feel like to do that also basically is ignoring the role that the Soviet Union played in the world, in terms of the world peace movement especially. And yeah, and I think like in relation to, I guess, how China has been trying to make sense of its history and to go back to the Bandung movement and to sort of like reflect on the Sino-Soviet split and I guess like the Indochina War and stuff like that. I feel like there's a need to have some continuity, but also to like really reflect on like, okay, what are the lessons for this time? Because I also think that, yeah, like this idea of civilization, it's in some ways like a timeless or an eternal concept, but what's really important about civilization in this time is the question of modernity. Like, what is the actual direction of modernity? And I think that especially with Robeson and Du Bois and this thing of the black worker, or this question of people's democracy, and the question of like, can the worker govern? Is it the worker that produces society and civilization? Like, you can't talk about civilization or modernity and not get that part.
That's right.
Right. Yeah. And so I don't know, I think it's just very complicated because on the one hand, when we're talking about like the multipolar world or international democracy, that I think is still very clear in Putin's vision, but I feel like we have to flesh out we're not just talking about a multipolar world and different ideas. We need to actually drill down into what international democracy means, which means that it's not just like, oh, like each government or each state like is equal, but it's actually that they're equal because every person, every worker has the capacity to rule. So, yeah.
Damn.
Because the way that Du Bois frames the Soviet Union and Russia and America is as an experiment in almost a new type of civilization. Like, I had never encountered that way of framing the Soviet experiment before, but
Does he use the phrase that you just used?
I feel like he talks about it. I don't know if it's exact wording, but he says it.
How does he say it?
The greatest experiment in human civilization. Or something. Because I had to find that quote from the truck.
The Russian.
Wow.
Guys want to say anything else? This is, everybody knows why we're discussing it, because, we're not only discussing in the Free School Robeson and Du Bois and their approach to civilization and understanding, but also because we've studied the state. And, I'm with Nuri. I know when Jerry first told me about it, or mentioned, I think, in Free School, I could already see, I know where he was coming from. This replacing the whole history of class and history itself, and saying that Russian civilization is today what it was 1,000 years ago. Chinese civilization is today what it was 5,000 years ago, or African civilization is today essentially what it was 5 or 10,000 years. And really, if you want to go, and everybody, the big question then becomes origins. What is the origin of Russian civilization? What is the origin of African civilization? That's why, quote, Egyptology becomes a way of studying Africa, because you're studying the origins of African civilizations, so to speak. I think, and I agree with Nuri, I think you've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. And so, how do you account for the Russian Revolution? Or should we account for the Russian Revolution? Is that important?
Right.
How do we account for the national liberation movements? And this is big. Alice was showing me a book of writings of Sekou Touré, who also is looking at the question of civilization through the lens of class and socialism and a whole complex of things. So that's all I wanted to say. Go ahead, Nurani.
Yeah, because listening to it, it did make me think a lot about our study of Africa and the Bandung reading group with Sekou Touré and Ngouabi, because there have been a lot of they reference universality a lot. Like the question of what is a universal path versus what is like the African path. And I don't think it's actually pretty complicated, because I think when you're saying universality, it can mean two different things. One is like genuinely humanly universal, and then I think one is something that claims to be universal but actually just stems from like Europe or stems from like a specific experience. And in some ways, like that discussion of universality, I think also naturally in some ways connects to Marxism or socialism, because they're sort of talking about, is socialism the universal path forward? And I think both of them in their own ways say like, yes it is, but also it must be adapted. Like Africa must make like socialism. Like it has to renew it, has to make it something new. And I feel like with Putin too, he's sort of floating this idea of civilization as a universal thing, and I think he means it in that the Western civilization is not the only source, or like the only well.
And that's the positive.
Yeah, which is very significant. But then I think, what are the universal uses of civilization. And I feel like that's where, for me, like this thing of the worker or of class is important, and also what history is. Because I think there are multiple, I just realized there are like basically 3 categories that get tossed around a lot these days, which is like history, civilization, and then also like class. But I think a lot of, like the Marxists, I think would only refer to history and class. Whereas Putin, I think, is more focused on civilization and not even really history or class. But I think actually all 3 of those is important. And it's not just that you're combining 3 different concepts, but actually with like Du Bois and Robeson, it's this thing of Du Boisian sociology, which is like, what is the capacity of the human being? Right. And that's, I think, the only way to knit all 3 of those things together. But I also feel like that's kind of what Secretary and Wabe were already on when they were talking about the African man or the African personality.
Just to add to what you're saying is, I feel like one of the really striking things in reading like different African leaders in the pandemic is like, yes, the roots of Africa go back a very long time with like very, like Du Bois talks about it in the world in Africa, like Ethiopia, then like, all these regions, but that like what the African leaders and liberation movements of the 20th century were trying to achieve was also something new. Basically, and like the fact that they all these leaders like Nkrumah and Wabe, Secretary, it's like, yes, they saw themselves like, yes, I'm Ghanaian, but like, I feel like for them the central category was like, I am African. And that this is not just like a thing of like a descriptive thing, but it's almost like a kind of way of articulating the self-consciousness of the peoples of Africa, and that like, across this vast continent, which has been so degraded by the West and by colonialism and imperialism, like we maybe can achieve a new kind of unity that has not been achieved before on this continent, and also give to humanity like a new kind of consciousness. And that's why it's like this, like this idea of like the African man or like Pan-Africanism was not just like, oh, like it's not even just like a pragmatic thing of uniting against imperialism, but it's also almost like a a question of consciousness of like of the world's people, because if Africa was able to achieve that kind of new unity, like a genuine Pan-African like unity, that this would be the achievement of a different kind of consciousness, and that this would also be connected to the experiments of the Soviet Union and all that stuff. But I feel like this is partially also like how we conceptualize what the Afro-Asiatic reconfiguration of the world means as an advancement in humanity's consciousness as a whole. And that all of these African leaders and independence movements saw themselves, we are worthy of taking up this historic task. Like we can achieve something that has not been achieved before, basically in history. And I think that this is like part of the essence of it, which has not really been like passed down, because also,
I was just looking at, I went to look at the map, and maybe when I was studying about somehow introduced to it, I was nowhere geographically where I'm at now. But when I looked at all the countries in West Africa that had, not recently risen up, their original state of affairs and bureaucracy, right, was on a level like China would have been, like China is, or been.
Yes.
And, all of these Niger, it's about 8 or 9 of these little splinter, all these was under the song. I'm not talking about Ghana, the ancient Ghana. I'm talking about the way Songhai had to have an advanced bureaucracy, because it was maintaining, a more unified. There's still situations was going on in the continent, but you knew that you was in this range of their bureaucracy of how did they keep logistical.
Let me just interrupt, just to clarify one point. I think see, the thing is, the quote civilization state is older than the nation state. Usually, like you talked about the Songhai Empire, the Ghana Empire, the Mali Empire, these were successive empires which were not nation states, which has a lot to do with territory and other things of modernity, including capitalist economic relations. But see, this is where the problem of Putin, it's so much left unaddressed. But the earliest state forms we could call civilization states. The whole history of dynastic China is of civilization states.
Right.
But the civilization state in its ancient form, and that, partially why Kemet or ancient Egypt lasted so long is because, in fact, it did have this civilization state quality, which did not say that you had to adhere to laws, but said you had to accept a certain framework, a civilization framework of values and so on and so forth. I agree with Putin that the nation state formation threw out the baby with the bathwater. And you always had this tension, or these intellectuals such as Bradau and German and French thinkers who were trying to conceptualize civilization while at the same time talking about or living in the nation state, modernity. Now, somebody mentioned Samuel P. Huntington. And this is a very, I would say, evil man, because his concept of civilization was the clash of civilization, the conflict of civilization. That's not what Putin is saying, to his credit. However, if we say the modern civilization state, the modern civilization state is not the same as the ancient civilization state, because the modern civilization state exists within national legal boundaries. I mean, there's no way to get around it. But of course, since we are in a fluid moment of transition, how will the nation state transition to the civilization state? And how will national boundaries, for example, one could argue that the history of ancient India is history of civilization states. Ancient China, civilization states. Africa, you have civilization states from Egypt to Ghana, Songhai, Mali, to the civilization states in Southern Africa. The form that they took, I don't know. I don't think it's been studied. However, when Sekou Touré or Julius Nyerere or Marion Ngouabe and others talked about the modern African state, they would, to the extent that they were not assassinated, were pushing towards this concept of a civilization state. That it was not just that because Africa did not have the nation state form. It did not. So they were saying the modern African nation, be it Guinea, Mali, People's Republic of Congo, wherever, would have to at the same time be a civilization state, or a civilization state in becoming, in process of becoming. And that was so central to the assumption of national liberation, that we are not inferior. You know what I'm saying? But it was national liberation, but it was also civilization. I just want to mention one thinker that was a guy by the name of Clarence J. Mumford, who used a methodology known as civilizational historicism. He had been educated. He's from Cleveland, black man from Cleveland who went and got a PhD in East Germany. And so he was trying to do precisely this, to synthesize the modern concept of class and political economy and all of the concepts of Marxism, but to frame them within civilization. But this.
If I could add to that, man, very exciting stuff. I want to definitely assert the importance and necessity of the category of civilization for our times, even just to understand the present moment of what is the rise of Western civilization and the basis for the current world order, which is the transatlantic slave trade and the creation of a.
There's no question of the modern European nation state is anchored to the transatlantic slave trade in many respects, which I'm sorry, last show. Which already, you could say, corrupts it, or determines it, and thus Putin does have a point that even for Europe, and this is Robeson. Let us get back to the grounding, the foundation of civilization, which is the folk, the ordinary people, which I don't think Putin has this idea of civilization as up here and the people down here. Robeson has the idea of civilization coming from the ordinary person. Which I'm sorry.
You're just getting me more excited. Yeah. So even just to understand the current order, and then what is the way out? We talked about the African consciousness, this oneness that people became aware of because of their common exploitation, and in trying to find a way out of it. It wouldn't make a little African country with the rest of the sea of domination is not even logistically feasible.
No.
And then because of this, unfortunately, oneness in inferior treatment, people got to know each other and understood this greater oneness. And then in struggle, a further oneness can be made. And I think that's a great contribution.
And that is. It's the possibilities in this theoretical, if we do this right, the theoretical construction and acknowledgement. Now, I know Putin said, and Africa has a civil. Well, but the question is, Africa consists of at least 4 civilizations. At least 4. Because see, what constitutes, or what are the boundaries of civilization? One of the key boundaries is language. And in Africa, there are 4 fundamental major linguistic groups. People talk about Arabs, you hear this anti-Arab, but what is Arabic? Arabs are people who speak Arabic. That's why they're called Arabs. But Arabic is an Afro-Asiatic language. It is a part of the linguistic group defined as Afro-Asiatic. Then there are Bantu languages. The largest linguistic groups in Africa are the Bantu languages. And you got Bantu A, which is more northern, and Bantu B, which is more in the southern or southeast. For instance, Swahili is a Bantu language. The languages of the Pular languages of Senegal and Mali and other parts, Bantu. Now, but all Bantus are not the same. So there are 2 major linguistic groups. So then you have the other major linguistic group, and that is the linguistic group in Southern Africa, in South Africa, and so on. If I could just make one other point. I came to the conclusion, and this was at the event in Chicago, that Robeson believed that in every civilization is every other civilization. and therefore that there is a common linguistic heritage. And we know this as a fact now.
Yeah.
That 7 African languages are the mother tongue of all other languages in the world. And this is not conspiracy theory.
Right.
You know,
Right.
the other thing is that genetically, every human population, that which makes every human population human, or what they call anatomically modern humans, is that they all carry African genes.
Whoa.
Every human population carries African genes. The next question is, but what is the variation upon the African genetic pool? It's the Asian genetic pool.
Yep.
There are 2 major genetic groups in the world, African and the derivative of it, Asian. Now, did I make this up? No.
No.
I really did. And this is not conspiracy. The great work on this population genetic work is called The History and Geography of Human Genes, published about 1995 by 3 Italian scientists. The head, Luigi.
Mario. And Bowser.
No. Luigi Cavalli Sforza. Yeah. But the thing that I want to say is that every study of human origins genetically or of human language goes back to a single origin. Now that doesn't mean one thing. It meant, like I said, it is considered that there are 7 African languages that are the foundation, are the mother tongue of all other languages.
Yes.
When Robeson said that he detected through his study of folk culture and language a civilizational link between Central Africa and Eastern Europe, in other words, Slavic languages, maybe others, but he said there was a civilizational link. So all I'm saying is that it is nothing new to talk about civilization. This is not new, but the question is how you talk about it. And I think again, I would say the civilization state is the original form of the state. Going back to ancient Egypt, ancient Babylon. The earliest states were civilization states. They were not nation states. The modern civilization state emerges within the nation state. You know what I'm saying? And Putin is right here, it bursts the bounds of the nation state. The nation state, more than not, became a mechanism of imperialism and conquest. And Putin is right here. His answer, I think, is not right. The nation state carries with it, or is, I'll use tarnished or compromised by the history of colonialism, etc. Back to modern Israel, the myth of a Jewish state, when in fact it is a Zionist state, but it is a European state, nation state, which hence carries all of the assumptions of European supremacy. You see what I'm saying? Whereas when you get Sekou Touré or Marianne Ngouabe thinking this through, they are not thinking about a modern European nation state, which would be a state that oppresses, predatory, all of that. They are talking about what, at least as, if you follow the logic of their theorizing, they are talking about a new type of state that is civilizational and hence not constructed in order to oppress others. I'm sorry.
That was crazy, Doc. That was crazy.
Let him finish and then.
Yeah, so that the African, I guess,
You don't mind if I
No, I like the back and forth. Let's keep going.
See, these questions, whether one wanted or thought about addressing them in the early stages of the struggle for, let's say, political independence in Africa, ultimately these questions confront you. They are inescapable. So it is not just to say, and I agree with Putin here, we are waging an anti-imperialist struggle. Yes, we are waging an anti-imperialist struggle, but that's the anti. But then what is the positive?
Right.
You see, it has to be, almost a remaking of the world. As in, that's why this whole idea of Afro-Asiatic, well, obviously we're talking about civilization, civilizations, but we're talking about the transition towards what Putin is viewing, a new form of relationships between humanity. But what he misses, that in every civilization is every other civilization. And that is,
Hi.
We'll stay quiet.
no. This is so beautiful. This is Eddie and Nathan's mom.
Hi, everyone. Hi. Nice meeting you all.
So nice. Wow. Okay, go. I'm sorry, Eddie. I cut you.
Yeah. This is the I guess African contribution to the Afro-Asiatic reconfiguration which we talked about, and I want to make the point that I guess that Americans have a contribution to make as well, because the situation here is so much more intimate because we had to live amongst each other in ways that haven't happened anywhere else in the world, and so our contribution to civilization and overcoming and having new human relations. I think really is necessary even for us to connect to the rest of the world, for us to deal with our darker people here in a human way. I know there's probably something immediate and urgent about crises like Palestine and Israel that require direct intervention, let's say, but the long game is a civilizational assertion that will make it impossible for human beings to live like this together. And I think we're the ones that have the principal responsibility to do it because we've had to live together like no one else has with the slave experience.
Go, Derek.
So, in some of the Indian history I've been seized to something, is that this thing about using the word continent. And using the word continent, not just in India. So a lot of the more ancient rulers, if I sent out different people to do a survey for me, and you didn't know the expanse of my survey, and you told me where you lived at, if you never surveyed beyond that, then I knew that you didn't know the perimeters that my influence is reaching to. Like in Genghis Khan is sending out influence. He's not coming to tear you up. he's just sending you, he's sending you a battalion of people to tell you the water that you don't know about, the land you don't know about, the herd you never seen because you only live in one little pocket. But anyway, this continental thing is something that some of the rules, a lot of the rules in India was aware of, and if they forgot about it, the people in Africa had to be reminded about it, because this is a difference of talking to, like about the Great War, we talking to over more than half the whole continent at some particular point. They don't have TV, but this influence, this regard for civilization to be unmolested. This road that you're walking on, you do not destroy this road. It's like going to a shrine. You just don't bother something. But this kind of knowledge, this is knowledge, man. You say Mississippi, you be like, I'm going down there. This civilization. Oh, I want to go to Kentucky. I ain't going to Kentucky. That ain't the United States. So that little single state mentality, that live for people that want to live like that.
This is no question.
And that's a travesty for what I'm saying right now about India having a language in it of continental talks. Somebody that spoke to people beyond.
But this is very important what you say.
This was like it wasn't no accident. This was well thought out agriculture claims.
But see, this is very important, the point that you're making. Territorial boundaries. Mm-hmm. Territory and the drawing of boundaries. That's why they call it the nation state. The state that governs or rules within a certain territorial boundary. Then, and here again, I see where Putin is going. He wants to transcend that. Why should everything be seen through the prism of a nation state?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I think, I agree with you, that ancient nation states were not based upon territory, but based upon values. That's why a lot of wars back in the days were over religion. Right. It wasn't religion, it was civilization. And of course, the discourse in those times about civilization was in some ways, as Cheikh Anta Diop would say, barbarism or civilization. Barbarism only meant, is an anthropological category, meaning pre-state. Most of human history has been, quote, barbarism. And I don't like the word, but that just, that is pre-state. I don't know if anybody here has ever met a nomad. Very fascinating people. If you ever hang out with nomads, and they live in pre-state formation.
Right.
Other times you hear the word, and this again, tribes, my tribe. A tribe is an extended bloodline without a state, pre-state. It's nothing wrong. I mean, if modern human beings are 200,000 years old, at least 50,000 of those, 150,000 or more of those years of humanity are pre-state. When the state forms, let's say the ancient Egyptian state was formed in 5,000 BC, before the current era. 5,000 years before, let's say, the birth of Christ, okay? The Egyptian state is older, lasted longer than everything that came after it. Now, there were ups and downs and ideological struggles and civilization, and that's why, I mentioned the Pharaoh Akhenaten, who rose up with the philosophy of monotheism, which challenged the ideology of the civilization state, and they killed him. But the cat that came out of that was Moses. Moses was raised in the among the pharaohs under Akhenaten. But who is Moses? He is one of the great proponents of monotheism, which begins all of the religions of the Middle East. So-called Middle East, the Afro-Asiatic world.
Right.
You know, Judaism, Christianity, Islam come out of the Moses mystery. So I'm just saying that, you know, the ancient was never negated by the modern.
Exactly.
It was always there, albeit oppressed by the modern nation state under colonialism and the idea of white supremacy. You need it. I'm sorry. And here's where Putin is also right. He didn't use the word white supremacy. Maybe he's a little sensitive because he sees himself as white. But he can see himself as an Asiatic black man or even an Asiatic white man. But anyway, I don't know. But here is the key thing, that albeit suppressed by the nation state under the name of colonialism and white supremacy, it never went away. Nope. And so as the national liberation movements of Africa and Asia and the revolutionary struggle within China and India, as they rise, so does the civilization question. Again, not because they wanted to do it in an invidious, separatist way, they were in effect saying, and you could see it all over Gandhi, you could see it in Nehru and them, Tagore, you claim that we were inferior.
Right.
But here's a civilization that precedes everything you can even think about. You know what I'm saying? And so I was telling Eddie this. There's a young Mexican boxer named Barrio. I think that, and I was so impressed with him at his last fight. He said, I'd like to shout out to all of the indigenous people. I'm an Aztec. This is very important because the modern Mexican state attempts to negate the ancient civilization, although they have a museum of it. But he says, I am Azteca. That's what he said. I am Aztec. Now, and he said it up after the fight. He said, I want to give a shout out to all the indigenous people of Mexico. So I think this is a very, but let me stop there. But go, Nori going to say something. I'm sorry.
Well, okay, wait. I think that also with the nation state, like there are just so many contradictions in it because, like you're saying, not only the idea of colonialism and white supremacy, but then under neocolonialism and neoliberalism, it's not even as though those territorial borders are respected or that those nation state governments are respected or sovereign in any real way.
That's right.
So absolutely. That's also, it's just really interesting. And then this question of like if ancient civilization states were based on values, then I think that's also partially why wars were like all-out wars, because they were so like there's this theory of like, oh, the nation state will prevent war because then there's this idea of like a just war or like a limited war, whereas under civilization it becomes much more existential and basically like I don't know, it becomes like on a deeper philosophical
point.
But I think the thing is that what you're
Could I say something? But the concept of a just and unjust war precedes the modern nation state.
Okay,
I'm sorry.
No, but then the modern nation state idea was meant to just be one possible solution to that idea. But I think actually what you're saying, which is that we can't go back to the days of like barbarism versus civilization. And I think that's because of the historical experience where now like you can't go back to like this thing of like strict borders or even fighting about territory or about values, because I think that's why King's World House becomes so important, because also with like basically like atomic bombs, like modern weaponry, you can't go back to this framework of war. It has to be peace, like world peace. And I think that's also why I've been struggling a lot with this idea of like, oh, like how many civilizations are there in the world versus this thing, which is my instinct was actually like, the future is human civilization.
Well,
the thing is that, but then the state question is still a question that you do have to deal with. But I think that's also kind of why, like Sekou Touré, I realized why Sekou Touré is talking so much about like human development and like societal development. Because also I think when you were saying that Putin is kind of up here, whereas Du Bois and Robeson were on the level of the folk, it reminded me of a conversation that we had in reading group this past week, where we were talking about horizontal development and vertical development, which Sekou Touré was talking about. And it's like, it was really difficult for us to like try to figure out, but basically it seems like vertical development was kind of this thing of like institutions of the state, like culture, language, like these structures, whereas horizontal development is like the actual movement of the people. And so basically these vertical development, like these institutions help transmit culture and civilization, but horizontal development is like basically, I think, more spontaneous or like revolutionary activity. And so I think it's also kind of related to law and chance.
Can I just say something? See, when you get speakers like Sekou Touré or Leopold Senghor or Marion Ngouabi, people, or maybe even Amilcar Cabral, people who were colonized by the French, when you hear them write and speak, they're using often French anthropological categories. Of course, I would say inverting or subverting them, but they speak in a different way than Nkrumah will speak, more English American, you know, and using the categories of the Anglo-Saxon world as opposed to the French or continental European.
Because I think that's also why when we were saying that Robeson was saying that everything that is in me, like part of it is also in somewhere else. I think that's sort of this movement towards like world or human civilization, where the state structure still has to move towards the civilization state, but it's not about like, again, like separating or like dividing the world into like different spheres.
That's right.
Which I think is the crucial thing, and that's also what you're saying, which is that in the process of the national liberation movement, you have to find a way to actually completely transcend the old system of the oppressor.
Can I ask a question, Nuri, just about Korea, the division of Korea, and could it be that part of the division is the nature of the state? Would you say something about that?
You're putting me on the spot right now. But I mean, I feel like part of, I think maybe where you're hinting at me to go with this is that North Korea is built more on a civilization state model, whereas South Korea is completely locked into the nation state.
Or really a European model. Is that fair to say?
I think that's your idea, but yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I understand that.
Well, I have more of a question. You know, your definition of like a civilization state and nation state. Are you saying that like in like North Korea, for example, is based on like the values of people rather than like,
say that again?
Like the values of people rather than like institutions?
Yes. Well, see, the nation state came out of the civilization state. The nation state is at best 500 years old, whereas civilizational states go back 10,000 years. And frankly, the civilization states are the foundation of what is human, even in the modern world. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is that the nation state is more an aberration than a continuation of the normal trajectory of history. Did that make sense? It didn't make them.
No, it makes sense. It's just interesting because I feel like the nation state is almost inevitable. Because, in my opinion, I would argue that as society developed over time, over the centuries, it almost became a necessity to create these institutions for societies that are more complex or diverse, or needed more institutions to help them, even if those institutions weren't the best.
This is profound. The question, was it inevitable universally, or was it inevitable specifically? Okay, go.
No, I just want to tag a question onto that question is also, how much is it, does it come out directly as a consequence of the colonial, colonization and the world wars? How much did it become inevitable, if you want to think about it that way, as a consequence of these broad ideological, changes in ideological relationships that were coming up on the back of the transatlantic slave trade and the colonial empires of Western Europe?
That's right. And so the anti-colonial struggle is the first stage of the undoing of the, quote, modern nation state. Because the modern nation state does not work. Okay.
Go
ahead, Emily.
Well, because at first I remember when we started talking about civilization, I was like, why does it matter? I was like, why does it matter to define nation state or civilization state or anything? Right. But actually, the questions plus tagged onto the conversation made me think about, because I had just gone back from China, and I went to the National Museum of China, which is a really important museum. It's really hard to get in because you have to in places like India and China, because there's so many people, you have to fight on your phone to get a spot, even if it's free. And so for trains or museums, you have to fight to get your spot. So I finally got a spot with my mom, and we went, and I realized that this will go somewhere. But basically they had an exhibit about the Chinese Revolution, right, from the end of the dynasty period to what you see today. But within the exhibit and around it are all these other exhibits specifically around the question of civilization. So you would have exhibits that the little forward would ask you what is civilization? Why does it matter? And then it'd have a quote from Xi Jinping saying it matters because it gives us, our people, the confidence to assert something new. Or it's kind of similar to questions that Putin's asking, because I realized throughout the conversation that it becomes, the question of civilization becomes important because of what you're saying, Purba, in response to a question / response to what you were saying, which is basically people like Putin or Xi Jinping, for example, are concerned, and I'm sure the Indians as well, they're all concerned with the question of there is such thing as a state now because it's historical development. There must be a thing called state. There must be borders to a certain extent. Yes. Yeah. But what happens when you also have? But then it requires a modern civilization state that doesn't go back to the state. But you're seeking a modern civilization state, and the missing part is defining or revisiting civilization in order to undo and that is a necessity because in response to the period of colonialism. Because I always was wondering why Xi Jinping, he always does this thing where he gives speeches, and it's not to Chinese people. He says, I just want to say Happy New Year to all the Chinese people across the globe who aren't technically citizens of the Republic of China, but they live in the US, they live in Canada, or they live in Argentina or whatever. And I always wondered why. I was why does he do that? And I think it's because it's part of the question of civilization. My God, that's so cool. Because I feel in some ways what they're saying is they're you're not a citizen of the People's Republic of China, but you come from China. This is
Can I ask you a question? What about the Confucian schools all over the world? How would you?
Well, because I think part of it is what Nuri is saying about the idea is that if you can even get, say, someone like me or Michelle or Catherine or Alice, if you can get let's say Chinese Americans, if you can get them basically thinking about civilization, the hope is that you're helping usher in a
Yeah,
future
definitely.
where there will be something conceived as human civilization.
Definitely.
Like it will change the way
Everything.
different civilization states relate to each other.
That's why they had them in Africa too, in Latin
Yes,
America.
yes.
Well, I just wanted to make a small comment. This is also clarifying a lot for me because if the way you said it, the anti-colonial struggles and the national liberation struggles being almost like the beginning of the end of the nation state and back to the civilization state, but not back to what it used to be, but in the context of the modern world, which had these world wars, which had these shifts in ideological relationships. This also, makes it clear that if you were to think of a civilization state for any country in this point, which obviously Putin is, but I think about this in the context of India also,
Yes.
which in some ways is trying to return to that ancient,
Absolutely.
But
Yes.
the thing is that then you cannot do it without being rooted in the national liberation struggle.
That's right.
That's just the
That's
thing.
right.
It just
Yeah.
becomes so
Go ahead, explain it relative to no.
India.
The Prime Minister of India, Modi, who is trying to go back to civilization.
Yeah. Well, and
But
also.
no. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
And he's doing it in many ways in almost an overt rejection of Western values.
Yes.
And I think it doesn't come from him, it comes from the people who react to Western values, right? So, it's no longer, they're almost like saying, no, we will not be governed by these value systems which are not organic to us. But then going back, like skipping over the freedom struggle and going back to what was, in the time of the civilization state before modernity makes no sense because, this entire historical process took you from point A to point B to where we are now. And the only way you can talk about a modern civilization state for India is starting from the freedom struggle.
That's right. And here lies a big problem first of all, the class problem is not resolved just because India goes back to the ancients, what is supposed to be the ancient civilization state, which is really narrative rather than substance.
Right.
But the other thing is, then you get a quote in India, quote, clash of civilizations. You know what I'm saying? What is, because the most glaring example are the Sikhs. They said, well, we got a civilization and we want a civilization state, which is not, Hindu in the way that you want. So, I'm sorry.
No. All of that makes sense.
I wanted to add to this. I think this is very interesting, and what you were saying about the role of the anti-colonial struggle in this idea of the nation state, and the modern civilization state, the modern nation state, and to what extent it embodies the civilizational values. I think in terms of that, if you compare the states that came out of the anti-colonial struggle in India, and you compare India and Pakistan, I think it the question comes whether or not which is the civilization or which contains the the embodiment of the civilizational values of the Indian subcontinent.
That's right.
And I think this of course Pakistan was created as a Muslim state on the basis of on the basis of how the British divided India. But I think this brings into question the relation of India and Pakistan historically towards the question of Israel. And historically India has always been an opponent of the creation of Israel for the same reason that it stood against the creation of Pakistan, right? Because Gandhi and Nehru and all, they were all talking about the same idea that you cannot create a state based, you can't even claim a state to be based on based entirely on religion. And this ties to the question that you were initially talking about, whether or not it is actually a religious state or is it a Zionist state. And in terms of Pakistan, what's interesting is I think Pakistan, of course, it has there's the obvious connotation of being a Muslim state, so it has to be on the side of the Palestinians. But if you compare the response of Pakistan toward the Israel and Palestine conflict with other like Muslim nations like in Malaysia or Indonesia, it has historically been much softer. It has always it has always had that baggage of its connections with the US and like British policy and so on and so forth. And therefore it is always like you can make the claim that in comparison with all other Islamic countries, Pakistan, which was built out of which came out of the separatism and did not have the embodiment of the civilizational values. It ultimately stood on the side of the nation, the nation state of Israel. And India until recently, the relationship of the Modi government and so on. Until that, and with the I2U2 formations and all of these ahistorical alliances that are coming up with Israel and UAE and the US and so on. Until this, India has been very clear on its position towards Israel and Palestine.
Yeah, you should hear Indira Gandhi talk about it.
Yeah.
So say that again.
I mean, Indira Gandhi, she wouldn't mince words in the...
No.
I remember listening to a non-aligned movement speech where she's saying...
See this idea, quote, the civilization state, I say quote, or in the making and becoming, but on the right side of history, which is on the side of the anti-imperialist and anti-colonial forces. Yeah. But see, just being a civilization state don't answer that question in and of itself. And then a fake civilization state, which I think Modi is about, a more of a fake. So, and then even if you take Israel, a narrative about its civilization, but it's fake. A fake civilization.
I don't know how important this is, but one is, in Dark Princess, like when Matthew Farrakhan was at the table with all the other countries. And
oh my god,
because I was like, this is not good. I will go ahead. No, because I was just like, no. He was at the table with all these other countries, and like the description that Du Bois civilizations, yes.
Whoa.
It was always though,
and that was the question.
Right.
Were the African Americans a civilization? That was the question.
Yeah. No, because so like before King.
But see, let's go back to don't leave Dark Princess yet. But see, how was the civilization question resolved in Dark Princess?
I don't remember how. Well, it was resolved because resolved, but
or taken to a new level of consciousness, because the Dark Princess came to the United States and joined the proletariat, and she saw that here was a civilization, as Du Bois said, a civilization of potentiality. And then at the end she says, Matthew, your mother is Kali, which is the idea of the interpenetration of all civilizations.
But the reason why I brought up King.
I'm sorry, I didn't.
No, because that did have to be addressed.
Yes.
But the reason why I brought up King is that how to put this, the historical development of the consciousness, how it grew and matured of the Black proletariat, which had to develop its own language, had to develop its own music, the way it related to the world. It understood itself, but wasn't understood to the rest of the world. So like before King, the wording of the World House, a single garment of destiny, he had to say it. To express the consciousness of the Black proletariat and the contribution actually that the Black proletariat had to what we're seeing now, the future of humanity. And like, I think that the point that Putin is missing is the alarming relevance of the alarming relevance and the necessity of the Black proletariat consciousness in this moment of history. Because without it, is there also a missing piece? Like, I think, to Jeremiah's point about the whole question of Pan-Africanism, if it is a fully completed endeavor, struggle towards its completion that the African peoples were able to make. If that is the case, then I would say that's the first time in human experience that in that level civilizations were able to be quote unquote maybe unified or related to each other in a unified manner. Thus, human consciousness is at a different level of understanding the relationship of human beings to one another, and you can go into that in an emotional and a spiritual whatever. But then if the Black proletariat is capable not only of becoming human, which is also the whole struggle with the civil rights movement, and the whole question that this country would also have to deal with, but is also meaning that, okay, now I'm trying to say something where I don't have words for, because I'm thinking about the struggle to address the single individual becoming a human being. But what I'm also saying specifically is that what it would mean for the rest of the world, that it would be almost the first time that it would have been done, and it would have been done here, is what I would assume. And that's either me just being like, well, America's got something to say too, because I feel to a certain extent that, it's very almost easier as an Asian to think in this civilizational way, and that we're still very young. And
this is very interesting.
That imagery in my mind also made me think that though we are young, we also are born in such a time, which means we have a lot to say about it. And like in my mind, it also means that the world civilization, the world's people, its gift, it's what it is taking care of, what it is able to take care of, is also what will come out of the struggle of America. But in this dialectic, the American, the Black proletariat, that level of consciousness is also something new for the world's peoples to also understand themselves with. And they need King.
Elijah Muhammad, right? I might not have never had no relationship with that at all, but me writing a letter back to him and him responding back, it kind of like I had my. It's like having a transcendence, but sometimes people might not want to believe. Like Malcolm probably had it. He had it too, but a person might not want to really believe that because it didn't happen to them, and so they don't want to think that such a thing is possible. But since my handwriting was appealing to him, and his handwriting appealed to me, I could send him back the handwritten letter like his letter.
Like what?
I could send him back my handwritten letter like his letter was. Yeah. You know what I mean? So that was something, I didn't even know this was something that actually could happen. But anyway, the Asiatic, Black man, I didn't just stand there and look at the wall and see that. I wasn't just sitting there looking at the wall like, I'm gonna be like Seraphina. I can't find the words all the time, but I have to wait till they arrive. It's like things arrive to you, like lightning or something very quick. But sometimes we never been posed like this together. People from every country in this room here, people from every region, and we're right in this room. And it's kind of like, should I say something? Or should we revealing ourselves to each other? But in Dark Princes, Katawa is the statecraft. Her name is hiding the statecraft name of, when you couldn't do nothing about war without that book. That was just something about statecraft, but I'm not saying I'm the only one that know that. That's the name is covering it up. And Matthew's name is covering up. I told you the New Testament talk. Somebody would have said by Matthew, I don't know whoever would think of such a thing, but our language is not disclosed to us all the time. The language that we need to talk to people about, sometimes it's not disclosed to us till we get in a situation. I don't know where the person don't want to understand something, and we're talking not in different languages, but the ideas that we're using come from an original way for the freedom fighters to be protected, or the people that's fighting for freedom. So we understand the language better than somebody that's walking the room. We know y'all ain't on time or being on time, but so that we can understand, organic development as organic is not something that's already there. It's still like it's still coming up. You know what I mean? From wherever I came from, and wherever all of those individuals came from.
Can I say something you're hitting on something very important, and that is the relationship between language and thought, or language and conceptualization. And I agree with Seth, and I agree with you that often language is used to obscure thought.
Right.
And a person can say, I don't have the words, but I have the idea.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? And I think this is where the ordinary man and woman is so very important, because they don't always have the words, but they have the ideas.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? And we, just like we found out, people who don't speak a lot or don't have a way of talking a lot often have some of the most profound ideas, like John Coltrane. John Coltrane, you listen to him speak, you say, that guy ain't all that intelligent. Or you listen to Sun Ra speak, you say, he ain't all that smart. And then you see what they conceptualize.
Right.
The black proletariat imaginary. You know what I'm saying? You say that is, I so agree that just because a person doesn't have the words doesn't mean they don't have the thoughts.
Like I'm waiting like I know y'all faces, right? But I'm waiting. Michelle, everybody has that. The Buddhist world believes in certain enlightenment. I just happen to be one of those kind of long range students, drag everything around with me. But when it happens, because you're like, it's like embodying a characteristic. I don't know all my characteristics as I've been developing over the years, but when I see other students around me who I gotta be love for, then I'm just sitting there like, waiting for, because I want to hear it myself, like, wow, because we're so elated about our knowledge of the world that somebody tried to hide from us, or steal children. You want to steal children, and you want to steal their idea and just have them just messed up, and then just throw them out the window like you sacrifice them on what? And myself, I'm trying to reconfigure a language that is not all tied to your skin or to your proto-origins. I'm so sorry.
This is very important.
You know what I mean? And I'm trying to get this word out. When language reaches the it's like an ultimate particle of language where speech and how I write it want to behave together. It's like a part of our behavior. But when particle language, like language from India, reach Arabic, or China, then they can't even handle us no more. They don't know what to do with it. They don't know what to do with a room like this. They don't have, they don't even have the spatial consciousness to like tackle me. I'm like, I don't know what y'all doing, but I'm not playing with my language like that. I'm trying to listen very carefully because it's hard for students in the big universities to handle a gathering like this.
Yeah.
You know, the uniqueness, I gotta use my finger, the uniqueness of this kind of like, the uniqueness of this kind of exploration like Baldwin would be. They be like, just leave him alone, because he ain't taking nobody, he ain't taking no stuff. He's like dealing with how we want to address people. You know, how the way he addressed his humanity. Like what you just said, I love Fanon as being part of he was part of my tutorship, but over a long period of time, I ain't talking about one day, you know, we need somebody that we can live upon what they spoke about.
Yeah.
And the words that they use, and their behavior, their general behavior of how they treat the people, not to belittle other people
and
in front of
people. Ideas live? What ideas live beyond the author? The author died, but the ideas are alive.
Yeah.
And there are two foundations for living, well, there's only one foundation of living ideas, and that's the people.
Yeah.
Ideas live through the people.
Yeah.
But dying ideas are kept alive through a dying ruling class. And that's what we're finding today. But let me ask, are there any comments we want to...
Yeah. Where do I start? I guess I could do this. Well, so Jahan had a comment back when we were still talking about Israel, Palestine. I have to find it on Facebook. Saturday. Well, okay, so Why Not Learn says...
Who is that?
Why Not Learn?
Why not?
I think she's a frequent visitor. Why Not Learn says, in response to Amiri's comments, which I don't think we read, but he says, I believe Frantz Fanon is important right now. James Yaki Sales' writings on Fanon in particular.
Wow.
I don't know, it's a name, an author, James Yaki Sales, writings on Fanon in particular. So I'm not sure who that person is, but, and then Why Not Learn also says barbarism or barbarian were people that resisted the Roman Empire and colonialism.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
And then Jasper Thomas says, what does this have to do with the Leninist understanding of the state and how to overcome it?
Who said that? Yes.
Jasper, going back,
California,
which is interesting, going back to ancient times isn't possible, and the nation state makes sense in the development of capitalism. Expanding and conquering is a way of keeping capitalism afloat, not something that is inherent to capitalism. Calling this colonialism and acting like this is both the central problem of modernity and an aberration brought on by moral failures of whites is mystifying. Wait, I don't understand that. Hold on.
Well, see, what he's raising is a question of inherent in. You know, see, the question is, what is inherent in something is not what it was at its beginning. Something can become inherent to something over the course of its evolution. Then there's the logical determinants, and there's historical determination. In other words, we could say logically, the nation state does not need racism, or you know, that's logical. Or categorical or conceptual. But in the historic development of it is that. So we're interested in, you know, the concrete, that's all.
Okay. And then last comment from Jahan is interesting that Doc says the origin of the state was the civilization state.
I think so.
I'm curious how this relates to the Marxist concept of primitive communism.
Well, we can go back to that.
Okay, yeah, interesting. And then Don DeBar adds, sort of related, the puzzling aspects of Israelis not understanding the language of the oppressed that is very articulate when voiced, for example, by those who fought in the Warsaw Uprising. Yeah, that's it for comments.
I don't know, I know it's 2,
lunchtime.
Yeah. It's 2 o'clock or 2:10.
Oh, it is 2 o'clock.
Yeah, and I know some people have to go to work. Is there anything else anybody wants to say?
No.
Well, I just want to welcome Nathan and Eddie's mom here. We've heard a lot about you. Yeah.
Yeah. Eddie's favorite. I like that. Who's it?
Well,
Who's Eddie's favorite?
you have 2 wonderful sons.
Oh, thank you.
I mean, for real.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
They're better than me for sure. They're better than me.
I don't know about that.
Well, when I was their age, I wasn't involved with anything like that. So, yeah, they did it on their own.
It's never too late.
Eddie's just a number.
And mine is unlisted.
Anyway, so to our online audience, farewell, and we'll see you next week for another free school.
Bye.
Bye.